Hello, welcome to the Bitcoin Standard Podcast. Our guest today is Balaji Srinivasan, the entrepreneur and investor and the author of The Network State. Balaji, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm happy to join with the author of The Bitcoin Standard. The Bitcoin Standard meets the Network State. This has been like 10 years in the making. What a crossover. The Bitcoin Network State has to happen as well. So very good to see you.
Yes, I'm glad we're finally going to sit down and hash out the details of the future.
Great.
All right. So I guess, why don't you tell us, what is the network state?
Sure. Can I show a visual?
Yeah.
Can I project? All right. Let me show a visual because that picture sometimes says 1,000 words. So share screen, share tab. Okay. So if you just go to thenetworkstate.com and if I zoom in, go to the network state in one image. Okay. And this right here, can you see that on screen?
Yep.
Okay, that is a mock-up of a network state. What is it? It's very concrete. It's a physical social network. So let's say this is a network state that has 1,729,314 people with annual income, in this case, of $157 billion a year. I didn't put it in Bitcoin terms because it's undefined yet, but fine, just assume. And 136 million square meters. And it's got physical nodes around the world. It's as if every Chinatown in the world was networked together with modern communication technologies and with Bitcoin and with Starlink and so on and so forth. And it's got these little subdevelopments in every city that are actually not so little because you could have tens of thousands, even 100,000 people there. And together, the population, income, and square footprint or physical footprint of a network state is comparable to that of a legacy nation state. And then here is a GIF where I'll zoom in here. And let me zoom in. But basically this shows how a network state can emerge. You start with, and this will loop in a second, we'll start with one guy, and then it'll go from over here, it'll go from 1, then 17, 172, 1,000, 17,000, 100,000, a million. And if you look, you basically decentralize and you go into more places around the world and you basically build out the network and you've got more and more nodes. And so if Bitcoin is a decentralized currency, a network state's a decentralized country. So that's the idea. There's much more I can say, but that's a fundamental concept.
Yes, but how does that actually function as a state? So you're not saying here that this is going to be a federation of all of these cities, say Tokyo and Mumbai and Dubai are going to be part of the same state. You're saying people in those places will join states that cross these borders, but other people in the same city will be joining other states, all other network states.
That's right. So like the Ottoman millet system, for example, right? So let me give some precedents or precursors. So for example, Google has offices all around the world, right? Hilton or Marriott, they've got hotels all around the world. Starbucks has obviously, like restaurants or whatever you call them, coffee shops that are all around the world, tens of thousands of them. And they're all part of the Starbucks network, the Hilton network, the Google network. They're physically located in those jurisdictions. They're under, in some sense, the laws of the states that they're in. But really, much of what happens within those buildings is really bound by, let's call it the private law of Starbucks or Hilton or Google. Like, for example, their brand is on the walls, their mores basically govern who's in there. And you can swipe a card at Google San Francisco and get into Google Berlin or Google Bangalore. And you're really on, in a literal sense, the same network, in the same sense of the same intranet that connects all these places, right? So then if you think about physical nation states, have you ever been to Indonesia?
Just Bali, briefly.
Just Bali, okay. So if you ever look at a map of Indonesia, it's a group of islands separated by ocean that think of themselves as part of the same country. So what if you had a group of islands separated by internet that think of themselves as part of the same country? Now, it may turn out, by the way, that most of those pieces are more like embassies in another country. But eventually, one of those nodes could get enough. Let's say you have 100 of these nodes around the world. Let's say large Google Office type things or what have you. But for the 101st, you accumulate enough capital that you can crowdfund a peninsula or an island that some state has not had use for. For example, do you see what Egypt did with Dubai, Ras Al Hekma? Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Yes. So basically, as you may know, like the UAE, which is, I think, a very well-run country where I think we were in Riyadh the other day, but you've been to Dubai, I'm sure. And Egypt, Egypt was blown up by the whole Arab Spring and so on. I think they've achieved a reasonable level of stability. I don't know every in and out of Egyptian politics, but it's certainly better off than, let's say, Libya, which was pushed into, unfortunately, like civil war. But Egypt has, debt issues. So they have this promontory that pokes out into the Mediterranean, Ras Al Hekma, and they did a deal with the UAE to manage that. And the UAE basically paid them $35 billion to essentially rent out the peninsula and put it under UAE governance, right? It's not quite the Louisiana Purchase, but it's in the ballpark, right? So, like if we go back to the 1700s, 1800s, there was a time in the era of hard money, and so that's how the network state and Bitcoin connect, and I'll come to that. In the era of hard money, territory was something that states had to buy and sell. And so they did. There was the Louisiana Purchase. There was the purchase of Alaska, so-called Seward's Folly, but it was actually a very canny purchase. And at various times, basically, states exchanged territory for hard currency. Now, as you're probably aware, in the 20th century, with the century of centralization and the century of communism and Keynesianism, but I repeat myself because Keynesianism. See, like remember what I said? What did I say in Riyadh? I was like, I speak Maximalist fluently, I think, right? And I'm very sympathetic in many ways to a lot of what you guys say. I'm not myself a Maximalist, but I'm very sympathetic in some ways. In the century of communism and the century of Keynesianism, because Keynesianism is communism for wimps, right? Communism, at least their thugs go house to house, kick in your door. They have to shoot you for your farm to collectivize it or whatever. The Keynesians just hit a button and dilute you down silently. It's like the difference between like a wolf and a mosquito, like the mosquito tranquilizes you, right? Drains your blood. The wolf, at least, okay, you got to fight, face to face with the communists, right? So anyway, in the century of communism, in the century of Keynesianism, there's this great book by the Army War College called, I think, Gold, Blood, and Treasure. And it observes that the 20th century was the first century where governments didn't run out of money to wage these crazy wars. They had such, because technology favored centralization to such an extent, because they had paper money, they could just seize assets and just drive their men and material into each other until it was all just a bloody ruin, right? But in previous centuries, they were much more constrained. They just couldn't go to war to such an extent, right? Now, with the age of hard money coming back, in my view, this sovereign debt crisis is going to, it's already meeting. It already means the cost of living crisis people are talking about is really a sovereign debt crisis. Buy now, pay later, except the pay later is now, for many in the West, unfortunately. And what that means in the fullness of time, and not maybe so long, I don't know, by 2035, 2040, bankrupt Western states will have to sell territory, just like what Egypt is doing. And actually the precedent for this is the USSR. And, I can talk about this, but basically you're somewhat, but just jump in and stop me anytime. I'll just keep going and, right. And I think I'll map it to things out of your book, because there's actually a lot of interaction between the Bitcoin standard and the network state. But basically just, to reprise this, after the Soviet Union fell, okay, the Warsaw Pact also broke up. So Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union gave rise to essentially more than a dozen independent states from the USSR, plus all the Warsaw Pact countries newly independent. And Russia in particular, because they were very proud and nationalists, they inherited all the debts of the Soviet Union, but they had like half the number of people. Right. Whereas Estonia, for example, this is a crucial thing, a big incentive for Estonia seceding, in a sense, from the Soviet Union. They inherited none of the debt. Right. So they could start off as Estonia and reboot and have this meteoric rise and so on. It's not everything. They still have to execute well, but they did execute well. So, but Russia itself was very poorly managed, and it was kind of kleptocratic and so on and so forth. And, people talk about it, and the conventional take on it, which has some truth to it, is the, post-Soviet Russian government, it just sold all these assets for a song to the foreign speculators, the oligarchs, and so on and so forth and whatnot. And there is some truth to that, okay? But I will flip that around, and I'll give, at least to understand from the other side, if you are a foreign investor and you have hard currency, and someone in 1992 is saying, do you want to buy a coal mine in Siberia? Okay. This is like in the territory of the former Soviet Union. This is the genocidal, psychotic dictatorship that killed millions of its own people and had nuclear weapons. And it's only been dead for like a year, right? Or like a few months even. And so you don't know if communism is going to come back. And also, in that territory in Siberia, that coal mine hasn't made a profit since like 1912, right? So it's been like 80 years since anybody in Russia understood basic things like P&L and financial statements, let alone supply chains and other stuff. Nobody there understands the rudiments of capitalism. They've demonized it so much that profit was like a bad word for them. And so this coal mine that's never made a profit, that's in the territory of this formerly genocidal superpower, that probably doesn't have properly functioning infrastructure and so on, and then if you land your people there, you need your own physical security force because the Russian mafia will cut you, so to speak, right? And so you have to actually drip feed in payments there so that your guy who's on the ground there doesn't get killed by the locals, right? And they at least know not to kill the golden goose, right? So given such circumstances, you can understand why that foreign investor would say, okay, at least I need a huge discount on this property to take such a level of risk, right? So, and many of those guys really did get killed, or they lost their property later in seizures. The risks were real, right? And you can justify it. And I understand why. I think I can argue all sides of it. I understand why the quote oligarchs arose. I understand why I think Putin re-centralized all of the power when he took over. I understand that whole thing. But I'm just observing as a dispassionate observer of this period in history that bankrupt state had to auction off its crown jewels for hard currency. Because even like the bronze ovens, there's an anecdote that the bronze ovens that the Soviets were making, when they tried to export them, once communism went away and the subsidies all went away, they actually found that they were actually worth more as melted down bronze than they were as ovens. It was like literally negative value add. And I actually think American Keynesianism is a lot like Soviet communism in this sense. Should I explain why? You already know this, but maybe I'll give my take.
Go ahead.
Okay. So historically in the 20th century, prior to 1991, the American price system, because it was like globally competitive marketplaces, was a better way of dealing with things than the Soviet widget system. Because the Soviets would just crank out 1,000 shoes or 1,000 tanks or whatever, and they'd have quantity over quality and be the crappiest shoes or tanks. That's what the planned economy did, and so on and so forth. And now, actually, I would argue, and you may disagree with this, today, American Keynesianism is actually like that, where the centralization, the money printing has gotten to such a level that essentially the whole economy is centrally planned by the Fed and its allies, the Bank of Japan, and so on and so forth.
No disagreement.
And so they are, right? You agree, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so, like as an example, General Motors doesn't exist without a bailout. The banks don't exist without a bailout. But even more fundamentally, like the financial system really doesn't exist. The stocks are buoyed by the plunge protection team, right? Like, Greenspan, and the thing is, they have a million shell games. They'll say, oh, the Fed didn't directly print money. And it's like they extend the credit, or Treasury does something. But if you map Fed and Treasury as essentially a unitary entity that coordinate closely enough for most purposes under most times, sometimes they'll have a bank buy it by proxy. They play a zillion shell games with this to fool themselves and others. But fundamentally, whether it's stocks, whether it's asset prices for mortgages, whether it's General Motors, the entire 20th century is being propped up by printing. And American Keynesianism is like Soviet communism at the end, where it's a zombie economy that's being propped up by the state. And like 40 million people on SNAP, for example, in America, right? Just that one program alone. So the whole thing is actually a system where the prices aren't actually reflecting the production. Now, conversely, what's interesting is Chinese communism, on the surface, it looks like Soviet communism versus American capitalism all over again, where the Chinese actually do look at the absolute numbers of widgets as one of the key variables in their system. Like they're looking at production, physical production. But why is it why is Chinese communism working this century and American capitalism not, whereas it was in reverse the past century? And I'd argue it's because Chinese communism is fundamentally disciplined by international markets. They crank out all these cars, they crank out all these ships, but they have to sell them abroad, right? So even if it looks like they're cranking out widgets like the Soviets were, the fundamental difference is they're capitalist abroad. By contrast, the Americans have essentially destroyed capitalism within their system with the money printing. So they're actually communist, but it looks capitalist, and the Chinese are capitalist, but it looks communist. Let me pause there. There's more I can say.
No, I agree entirely on this. I think communists, America is basically increasingly communist country which calls itself capitalist, and China is increasingly capitalist country which calls itself communist. I think for the political stability of both places, you need to call yourselves with the correct term, capitalism in the US and communism in China. But I think if you were to bring a dispassionate person and teach them everything we know about markets and how markets work, and look at the two countries dispassionately, well, China has a lot lower tax rates, and people experience a lot less inflation. I mean, they still operate in the fiat global world dollar system. The yuan is practically pegged to the dollar, not exactly, but it's pretty much flat over 20 years. So the Chinese government is not really profiting from inflation as much. And the Chinese central government, I think this is a really curious statistic that very few people mention, is the Chinese central government has very little debt compared to the American central government. The Chinese provincial governments have debt, but if you add the provincial governments to the central government, it's still less of a debt load than the US states added on to the central federal government debt. So there's more government borrowing, there are higher taxes in the US. And by these very simple measures, the US government is more of an interventionist government. And China protects property rights better, because the most important way in which property rights are violated in modern economies, where you don't have war, and you don't have mass theft of property, and you don't have lawlessness on the street. The most important metric for how much you can keep of your wealth is probably taxation and inflation and government debt by extension, because it's something that is funded by taxation and inflation. So by these metrics, you see that in fact China is probably more of a capitalist economy than the US at this point. They've got lower taxes, so people have more freedom. And I think if you were to make the analogy with 1980s Soviet Union, it's the US that has the decrepit train stations. It's the US that has the crumbling infrastructure. The US looks a lot more like the Soviet Union in the 1980s than China today looks like the Soviet Union in the 1980s, I would say.
Interesting. So, well, actually, I did not know that fact, or that that concept about the provincial governments having debt, but versus central government. I want to relate it though to something. It makes sense because this is a very high signal book. Have you ever read this? How China Works: An Introduction to China's State-Led Development by this person, Xiaohuan Lan. I'm probably mispronouncing that. Do you see that one?
No, I have not.
Okay, this book, so can you see this book on screen?
Looks
okay,
like
great.
It, yes.
How China Works. So this book it's got like some very meh kind of cover. It looks like just some very forgettable textbook. Don't judge this book by its cover. It's very high signal. It's really worth reading. I think it says a lot. And in particular, for example, to your point, state governments within China are expected to mostly fund their operations out of their own pocket. And actually a big part, there's also a very good post by a guy named Andrew Batson on how the Gaokao explains China. This was a little thing they just did a little bit ago. So this is another very good post. I'll put this on screen. Just something I think of as high signal. Did you see this one? Exams are everything in China.
Mm-hmm.
So why is this a really good post? Essentially, it's worth reading, but essentially he makes the point that the Gaokao which is the Chinese national exam, it's like the SAT, but much more intense, is a centralized hierarchical competition. And once you really understand that concept, you can see many things in China through that lens. So for example, the central government sort of sets up the game, and all of the states and cities and so on, provinces compete with each other for economic development. But the central government makes sure they never get into like shooting each other or getting too extreme. It's economic competition. It's not physical competition, right? Even with all the crazy things that sometimes happen in China. The other thing, lots of other things the central government does, they rotate the managers of those provinces so they don't get too much localism or affection to any one thing. They're kind of managing all of China rather than one place. And even with their tech companies, they let them all just smash it out in a given industry, but they kind of set the rules of the road. It's almost like UFC, right? There's like some broad rules, but then they punch it out, right? And so it's not that surprising to me, perhaps, that China kind of keeps its central government relatively debt-free, but allows its provinces mainly to go bust, perhaps to go bust, because it's really bad if the central government goes down, but if a company goes down, it's survivable. You just have other healthy tissue. But I have to go and check that. I hadn't heard that until just now, so that's interesting about that point. One other thing I'll show you, by the way, the single best illustration, which I think is interesting, of Chinese property rights, which I don't know if I fully understand, but at least I'll put it on screen, are the nail houses.
Yes, that's a great example, yeah.
Right? So these things are common, or at least there's many photos of them, pre-AI, that show houses like this in the middle of like a giant highway or something in China. And what they suggest by their mere, go ahead.
Or a parking lot sometimes.
Or a parking lot or a real estate development, something like that. What they suggest by their mere existence is that the entire concept people have of, the Communist Party can just bulldoze people, nobody can resist. Well, somehow property rights were strong enough that they couldn't eminent domain or didn't want to eminent domain everything, right? So there's something interesting going on there. And I won't say that I fully understand, because obviously the Communist Party is strong within China. So I won't say I fully understand it, but my draft is that the party is actually loath to use full state power against a peasant because that looks bad, right? And so, whereas if they're using it against, let's say, Jack Ma or somebody like that, then it might be like, okay, they can spin it a little bit differently, but they're hesitant to use that level of power. They understand there's practical constraints in terms of their popularity, and they don't want to spend down popularity for small things. So that's kind of how I think about it. But that's a draft explanation. I don't think I fully understand when the party uses its power versus not on something like this. I think it was a matter of national security or something. They would just bulldoze it, but I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, no, I think there's a pretty compelling case that could be made that property rights in China are very well protected. I mean, certainly there's been a massive revolution in the sanctity of property rights in China over the last 50 years. And so I think there's a strong case to be made that it's not really a communist country. Having said that, I still think it is pretty, it's pretty remarkable that there is still an enormous role for the government in economic development in China. And that does involve a lot of socialism, a lot of central planning. It does involve a lot of centralized control over economic resources. But I would say, the Mises' critique of socialism fundamentally comes down to property rights. It's not an incentive issue. Most people, when they think about the problem of socialism, they think about the issue of incentives. If you don't let people get rich, they don't have an incentive to go to work. And that's maybe true, maybe not, but that's not the economic argument. Because you can solve the incentive problem. You tell them you die, or you starve, or you get thrown into gulag. That's much more incentivizing than getting rich, right? You'd rather not get thrown in the gulag than it's a stronger incentive than becoming rich.
On that point, by the way, that is my draft hypothesis for why wars, quote, stimulate the economy, is because it's not that the broken windows argument is correct. It is that it's do or die mode that sort of conscripts everybody in a way that they're like, okay, I better work or I die. Like in the sense of, so it's a little bit like everybody drinking Red Bull or something, but they're like, if I don't put in my all out effort into the economy for a minimum price, I die, right? So that's not good, but that's a better explanation than the various kinds of Keynesian theories. Do or die seems to be more explanatory.
I think I think the better explanation is just that they cook up a bunch of nonsensical statistics to say that the war led the recovery. World War II is the best example of this. World War II did not cause the recovery. The end of World War II caused the recovery.
Right.
At a time when the Keynesians were out there saying this is going to be the biggest depression in human history if we stop the war. I mean, Paul Samuelson, who practically wrote most of the world's textbooks in the second half of the 20th century, he said this, I think, in 1943 or 1942. He said something along the lines of, if the unthinkable disaster happens and the war ends in the next 6 months, we will have the biggest depression.
Did he say that? Interesting.
Yes. Yeah, because in his mind, the reason the economy was quote unquote recovering was because of all the military production.
Well, oh my God.
And
well,
so if you
the
stop killing Germans, then you are going to make the American people starve, because then GDP number doesn't go up. So it's that mentality that makes them say that it was the World War II war effort that got them out of the depression, when in reality World War II just prolonged the depression, and it was the end of World War II. And the other thing about the end of World War II is that the end of World War II ended the New Deal. That was the real kicker, because after the war died, after the war ended, FDR died, Truman took over, Congress was become Democrat, Truman was a Republican, they were Democrats, they couldn't agree on anything, and so most of the statutes of the New Deal ended. So,
I want to show you something which is somewhat coincident with that. So this basically shows that for thousands of years, if you take the center, and of course it's an approximate science, but if you take the civilization that is Japan, the civilization that is China, civilization that's India, in the Middle East and Europe and so on and so forth, and you take the center of mass of their respective economies and you average that on the surface of the earth, for thousands of years, the center of mass of the global economy is roughly in the middle of Eurasia, which is not to say that it's literally in Afghanistan or whatever, but rather that if you average Japan and China and India and Europe and so on, you got something around here. And then what happened with the Industrial Revolution is the center of mass rocketed out to Europe, and then they all blew each other up with all the wonder weapons. And then after Japan had been nuked and Europe was in ruins and China was communist and Russia was communist and so on, then basically the US and Western Europe were the only two capitalist places on the surface of the earth. So the world economy was here. This is the most westernized and most centralized, because there are only like 50 entities globally, 50 countries, basically. Everything was rolled up into these multi-hundred million person states. This was the most centralized and westernized the world had ever been in history. And then that continued for about 40 years or so. And then after the end of the Cold War, everything rocketed back out east because China was no longer communist. India was much less socialist, arguably capitalist now. Russia was no longer communist. Vietnam was no longer communist, et cetera, et cetera. So now history is running in reverse. So here, this was happening for thousands of years. This was happening for hundreds of years. This is happening in tens of years. And so the period that we're talking about was like around here. And everybody thinks about this as like the way things are in 1950 as the way things are supposed to be. But having the rest of the world completely blown to smithereens is actually an extremely unusual state of affairs. And so everybody who's like, oh yeah, remember 1945, remember that. That was like the nadir of the world for almost everybody else other than Americans. But because English is the global language, and so on and so forth, many people have had their histories or memories almost erased, and they don't realize just how bad that period was for everybody who wasn't in North America. Let me pause there. Maybe you have some thoughts.
The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by thesafehouse.com, my independent publisher and bookshop, selling the best Bitcoin books in high-quality cloth hardcovers built to last for generations. Most books these days are pretty fiat. They're flimsy and they fall apart quickly, and I did not want that for my books, so I set up the Safe House especially to provide you with beautiful, long-lasting classic cloth hardcovers you can proudly pass down for generations. You can get copies of my 3 books, The Bitcoin Standard, The Fiat Standard, and Principles of Economics, and you can also get copies of Lynn Alden's Broken Money, Parker Lewis's Gradually Then Suddenly, and Matthew Lysiak's Fiat Food, to which I contributed a few chapters, and Mexican billionaires Ricardo Salinas Pliego's new book, The Bitcoin Enlightenment. We now offer bulk discounts so you can buy books for yourself and for the friends and family you'd like to learn about Bitcoin.
Buy any 2 books for $50, any 5 books or more for $20 per book, and for more than 50 books, it's only $15 per book. Go to thesaifehouse.com, the SAIF house.com, where you can get all of these books in high-quality cloth hardcovers, delivered worldwide, and get 10% off for paying with Bitcoin. With fiat money constantly debasing, preserving your wealth isn't an option or luxury. It's a financial and moral imperative. If you're familiar with my work, you know the only financial advice I ever give is to buy and hold Bitcoin for the long term. This has never failed anyone. If you want to buy Bitcoin, I strongly recommend using Swan, a group of hardcore Bitcoiners laser focused on making Bitcoin easily accessible. While most scramble to react to each new crisis, Swan private clients are already positioned in the only monetary asset with absolute scarcity, Bitcoin. Swan Private partners with families and institutions who share a principled conviction in Bitcoin as the foundation for multi-generational wealth. With concierge service, deep expertise, and uncompromising security, the Swan team helps clients exit the crumbling fiat system and secure their future in sound money. Today, Swan Private serves more than 5,000 high net worth clients who have purchased more than $4.5 billion of Bitcoin and put it into cold storage. If you're ready to move beyond the false promises of fiat, start your long-term Bitcoin strategy at swan.com/safe, SAIF.
No, I agree entirely. I think it's very true. And to go back to the original point on China, I'll just say the fact is, I think this is kind of a challenge to what Mises says, and that Mises says the governments cannot plan because the absence of property rights means there's no free price system. Therefore, there's no rational way of calculating. Because in his model of socialism, the government is the one that is producing the input goods and the final goods. And so the government is buying from itself at all stages of the production process. And therefore, if it's a monopolist buying all of the same goods from itself, it has no mechanism for pricing things. Well, China essentially seems to have hacked that in a way by, well, I mean, they haven't really hacked it, but in a surreptitious way, they hacked it by solving the problem, which is allowing people to have property rights, which creates markets, therefore real prices emerge, therefore economic calculation and planning become possible. But I think the key thing is they are operating within a global market, as you said. Because they're operating within a global market, they're able to get global prices as inputs, and then they're able to perform calculation. And then to go back to your point on the national exam, the Gaokao that they have in China, I think that also is probably an important factor in explaining this, because, you may say what you want about the issues of socialism. Putting smart people in charge makes things better. So one of the ways in which they make things better is that they give people property rights. And then that means that when they start taking decisions, they make good decisions. So it's a remarkable fact that China has recovered from communism in an I would say unmatched way. Very few other places in the world have managed to pull this off so dramatically and so quickly, and to advance so much. I mean, at this point, you arguably could say the Chinese economy is larger than the U.S. economy in real terms.
Absolutely. Have you been to China in the last few years?
No, I've been to Hong Kong once, but no, I'm planning on going to China soon.
I think a visit to China, basically my view is, when I talk to an American friend or any American friends, I ask them if they've been to the following 7 cities. I say, have you been to Warsaw, Dubai, Riyadh, Bangalore, Ho Chi Minh City, Singapore, and then Shenzhen? And then actually I'll also throw in some, smaller Chinese cities, or less well-known, Chengdu and so on. So it's actually quite a large city, but, things are in the interior. There's the 4 Giga cities like Guangzhou, Shenzhen, Beijing, and Shanghai, but then there's others that are people don't know as well. And I think that unless they've been to those cities, they're simply not calibrated on what the world is today. You are. I think you're a smart guy. You've been around a bit, but it's impossible to travel from America to China and to take off in some blue city with, mentally ill drug addicts running around, literally, often within a drive to the airport, and then land in China and walk around and see completely clean streets and, people just having fun at the mall and, totally spotless everything, you have to realize China has won, right? It's actually already there. And, this is finally getting priced into U.S. posture where the U.S. is actually retreat. There's a weird thing happening, which I'd call a shouting retreat. Right. It's similar to how, during the Biden administration where they're saying inflation is transitory, while they're selling as many bonds as possible. Right. And then they jack up the rates on them and destroy everybody who believed Buffett when he said, always bet on America in 2021, after the BLM riots, after all of that craziness, after, and so on. They just got ruined because even the New York Times ran this article at the time was saying banks are loading up on bonds, but not because they want to, right? Because these were really low interest rate bonds and they were just buying huge amounts during this fake 2021, going out of business sale or going out of business print. Anyway, point being, just like the Biden administration was saying, inflation's transitory, bet on America, buy bonds. And if you did, you got destroyed with multi-$100 billion losses. In the same way, the quote Department of War is basically fake, because it's calling itself Department of War and doing all these chest thumping kind of things. And I understand why they're doing it, by the way. I'm actually a lot more sympathetic to them, but they're at the same time executing a retreat. They're retreating in Ukraine. They basically, got beaten by the Houthis. Certainly they weren't able to beat the Houthis militarily. NATO was not able to beat Russia militarily. And if you can't beat the Houthis or Russia, you definitely can't beat China. And so Hegseth, who's a defense secretary, is smart enough to realize this. On a podcast last year, he said something like Chinese hypersonics could sink all U.S. aircraft carriers in the first 20 minutes. And other people within the defense establishment, like the Raytheon CEO, has said you can't decouple from China. And the previous Secretary of the Navy said China has more shipyards, or one shipyard cranks up more ships than the U.S. Navy combined. So there's guys who understand reality. There's this Pentagon study that shows that the Tomahawks and JDAMs, their suppliers, Chinese, right? So China can just shut off the U.S. military, right? So the whole thing of all the defense stuff was in its own way basically about as fake as Build Back Better. It was like sort of the fake red colored Republican version, whereas the Build Back Better stuff is a fake Democrat version. Like the 360 something billion thing that Podesta had, that slush fund for climate, whatever, was basically just all to various green, leftists or whatever. But then the Republican version is defense graft, essentially, right? Now, I'm not saying it's all zero, because some of the climate money actually did go towards solar panels in China, which actually are really working, and some of the defense money is going towards interesting things in robotics and drones, which are working. So it's not, nothing's ever a total zero, right? But in general, they're retreating. The U.S. military has basically been beaten. They're also, and here's another thing in terms of where's the money going. Maybe you have a different view on this, but my view is it's going out of Western bonds because yields are spiking in the US, Germany, Italy, UK, Japan, France, and I believe also Canada. And it's going into four things: gold, digital gold, Chinese bonds, which have the lowest yields right? And then actually internet companies, right? So the way I put it is the two old school things are gold and Chinese bonds. And the two new things are internet companies and digital gold, right? And those kind of are the past and the future flanking the present. Of those, I think gold is obvious, digital gold is obvious, Chinese yields are relatively obvious. The internet companies one, though, I want to click on for a second, which is there's only 100 points on the cap table of an internet company. And while they do at times issue new shares, they don't do so without a very ritualized process where everybody's aware of the dilution in the denominator. And so it's a controlled issuance, right? And they only do it if there's actually a market for it and so on and so forth. So it's not quite as rationalized as Bitcoin mining, but it's a lot more constrained. And so, various, I'm pretty sure I've been trying to find a reference on this. Maybe you have one. My understanding is Mercedes-Benz existed before Weimar and after Weimar. Right?
Yeah.
So its 100 points on the cap table managed to survive that hyperinflation because a stock was a stock was a stock going through it. It didn't radically increase its money supply and so on and so forth. Maybe a lot of its vendors were messed up. Maybe a lot of its tires were expensive and crazy things were happening, but somehow it managed to weather that storm. I've been looking for something that talks about that. I've been trying to query AI over the past few years. Maybe I'll try again. Maybe you have some thoughts on that. Let me pause there.
Yeah, I think it's. I'm not so sure about how realistic U.S. foreign policy is, because I think with all of the trade nonsense, that was a little too much of saber rattling to be.
Oh yeah, that was crazy.
To just call
is it completely insane?
Retreat.
Yes.
Because they signed this deal, which was essentially Trump walking back everything, and China just had to walk back its retaliatory things. So it was a very silly stunt to go back to square one after this, but to introduce a lot of bad blood in the relationship and to make it so that there's all these stuck issues that need to be renegotiated in a year or two. The entire thing was completely needless, and I think there are just a lot of aggressive and belligerent elements within the U.S. government that seem to be hell-bent on a Chinese war. And I'm just beginning to get the same kind of U.S. foreign policy vibe around China that we've seen throughout our lifetime with so many bogeymen that the U.S. has fought.
I understand what you're saying. I think, however, that China has become so strong that there's a guy named Han Feizi of Asia Times, and his point was basically like, let's say U.S. strength was like this, and then China was kind of, U.S. strength is like this, and Chinese strength was like this, and then it was kind of coming up in the 2010s, and now it's gotten so much stronger that by the time the U.S. could turn around to react, China's just too strong, right? And it's kind of like a startup, by the time Blockbuster turns around to go after Netflix, Netflix is just much bigger, Yeah. And that plus the Russia-Ukraine war, I think Russia-Ukraine was the China-US proxy war in the sense that, people will argue the extent to which China is supplying Russia, and they'll pretend that NATO isn't fighting in Ukraine, but really they are. Right? In the sense, Russia and North Korea don't do something nowadays unless China lets them do it. Why are North Korean troops there? Probably China. Almost certainly China gave the green light for that. North Korea would not be doing something. North Korea is like a Chinese client state. And so is Russia nowadays, actually. Russia thought Ukraine would become a Russian client state, and maybe, but really Russia is alive because it's got all the cheap Chinese goods. And not just alive, it's winning. It's won, really. And, one of my friends calls Russia North Asia. They're South Asia, East Asia. Russia has embraced its Asian nature. And there's something called the Power of Siberia pipeline. They just leaned east, right? They're leaning towards Vladivostok. They're doing much more with China. They've got very complementary economies, Russia and China, because Russia has this just enormous wealth of natural resources, and China has an infinite hunger for that, for its advanced manufacturing. And probably what it means is, you can imagine a world where the late 20th century is totally inverted in the following way, where America is like the new Russia, where it's kind of like the former superpower that's sort of isolated and licking its wounds, but it still has some muscle that's gone to fat, but it might actually be torn in two. I actually think Democrats will side with Chinese communists and Republicans will become Bitcoin maximalists. Should I talk about that? Did we talk about this one?
We should, but I think we've left a little too many loose ends to.
Sure. Go through loose ends. Go. Let's go.
I think we were the reason we got into all of the Russia and China discussion in the first place, I think, was we were discussing sovereigns selling territory.
Yes.
And how that relates to the network state thesis. So let's just get to that. Finish.
Okay, fine. So let's go to that. Great. Thank you for coming back. Okay, so if we're going back to the age of hard money is a constraint, right? We're basically getting, in a sense, the hard money that libertarians wanted and the global government that progressives wanted, except that global government of governments is Bitcoin, which is the network that stands above states, that limits what states can do without the consent of others, right? and they simply can't steal like they've gotten accustomed to stealing. That means the 20th century state's business model outside of China is basically busted. One way of thinking about that is the cost of seizure increases. If you're a Venezuela-like kleptocracy, let's say it costs you about $40,000 to send a SWAT team to somebody's house. You need to make 40,000 in Bitcoin from that seizure. That's actually hard to do over and over again, right? So coercive seizure, which was the entire 20th century state and going back quite a way is the business model, that goes away. And you go to the subscription state instead, right? Only those states that can persuade people to part with their voluntary, it basically becomes voluntarism, right? Coercion becomes far, 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 far less viable. You have to go to subscription rather than coercion. There'll be a huge amount of thrash en route to this. And, like these states will not go easily because the state is not just a thing, it's also a group of people that will just hiss and bite and scream and scratch on their way down, which is what's happening. And you want to be kind of far away from that in every sense of the term. But eventually you go to a subscription state. And like, for example, we've actually got a proof of concept, which is more than proof of concept. Dropbox, Google, all of them have millions, in some cases, hundreds of millions or even billions of users that pay subscriptions globally. And their revenue is more than the vast majority of nation states. The vast majority of nation states have less than 100 million people, right? More than 50% have less than 10 million people. So these online networks have a completely voluntary, non-coercive mechanism of revenue generation, which is basically if someone doesn't pay, then their service is cut off. And when they do pay, it comes back on. So simple, so automated. Nobody gets mad. It's very fair, right? And you just put your card in. This scales to literally the entire world and every single person, and it happens billions of times a day. These payments are made. That is actually, and crucially, Dropbox is not asking you what's your percentage. You're not giving a percentage of your income to Dropbox. Yes, they do some kind of tiering where it's like individual versus enterprise subscription and so on and so forth, but it's much more reasonable than the progressive tax rate and so on in Western states, right? So in the 2040 time range, you get to the subscription state, like after the thrash, the sovereign debt crisis and so on. And these constrained states are actually a lot more like companies. And frankly, how much territory you can guard voluntarily, who knows, right? I think you're going to see a lot of asset sales. I mean, one way of also looking at this, by the way, Australia and New Zealand are actually better run than, they're not actually members of the G7. They're the best run Anglo states. Do you know why I say that? Maybe you're familiar with this.
I'm not sure, no.
So there's a great graph, I can pull it up if you want, which shows that they have the best debt to GDP ratios of like the Western kind of states, right? And Australia, for example, has a lot more guys who are working in mines and stuff like that because they're digging stuff out of the ground and selling it to China. So they have less, like China isn't deindustrializing them like America. China is, China's a similar relationship to Australia as it does to Russia, right? It buys lots of natural resources from them that are dug out of the ground and set there, right? So China has less, or rather Australia has less blue collar dissatisfaction relative to America. And it also has no illusions about being a military power or the global reserve currency and so on and so forth. And Australia also did something else, which is they sold or subleased a fair amount of national resources to actually get the debt almost down to like 4.7% of GDP right before the financial crisis. So they were, until the financial crisis, the best managed Western economy. They actually showed that you could cut it down. And a big part of that was asset sales. So that the Australian precedent, I mean, just like, how the New Zealand precedent of 2% inflation rates was like a big thing, right? I mean, 2% is at least good. They have some theoretical cap. It should be 0%. It should be -%, as you and I both know, right? But 2% at least is better than like total, right? So the same with these small states can sometimes influence others. I think the Australian precedent of effectively selling land. And when they're selling land, it was like sometimes they're selling concessions, like their airport is not managed nationally anymore, but others are managing it, right? So that's a model for, I think, where Western states that are reasonably managed are going to have to go. It's almost like selling off state-owned enterprises, right? Now, here's the issue. This presumes that there is a government to do business with. And I think in Western Europe, I think you'll have some semblance of a government. In a funny way, I'm actually in some ways more bullish. I'm more bullish on Americans than Western Europeans, but I'm more bullish on Western European governments than I am on American government, on the American government. Should I say why?
Yeah.
If Western European governments have lots of flaws, but fundamentally there's like still a civil society there. Like when you walked it, like the infrastructure is better, other things are better. Their demographics are better in many ways. Whereas in America, the only thing that the US exports are A, tech, and B, the dollar. And when the dollar goes, and it's going real fast, that's why they're doing remittance taxes, that's why there's tariffs. It's like any one of these policies, you think about it together. I think about it not as a conspiracy theory, but colony theory. Here's my argument. Like an ant colony, it's a meta-organism. And each individual ant doesn't necessarily know what it's doing, but the colony as a whole knows what it's doing, right? Like a flock of seagulls or a school of fish, right? So I think of the Western US government and all governments really as meta-organisms where you can model it as if it's a conscious organism, not omnipotent, but like an ant colony. An ant colony has an intelligence to it where you can model it at the ant colony level. Just like you as a human being, you have like skin cells, you have, hair cells. Those cells don't have a full state of what it is you're doing, but they will kind of work with you when you're doing things, right? Make sense? So if we model it that way, and you think of Democrat left and right as basically responding to the signal of the US government is running out of money, right? The Democrats say, take it from the billionaires, tax the billionaires. They're completely innumerate about this, but that's like kind of how they're thinking, right? And the Republicans say, take it from the foreigners, and they're innumerate about it because they think incorrectly, or they think only partially correctly, that America is subsidizing the world, but really much of the world is subsidizing America. So the reason I say they're partially correct is it is true that billions were sent to, let's say, Ukraine for this war, while only $700 was spent in Maui on these people who are affected in Hawaii. There's a truth to it, right? But dollar inflation is global taxation. And so all these countries that are sent, like Vietnam is grinding away to send shoes to America. What's it getting back in return? Printed dollars, database entries, right? Why does America have that power? Because it was the center of the global economy and it ran all the warships that protected the sea lanes and it had all the diplomats that signed 100 plus, economic deals, all these economic deals with 193 countries. And so it had the center of the global empire and therefore it had the ability to just print because it managed the database for everybody because they thought, okay, well, at least you're the best guy to do it. And so really, if you net it all out, Vietnam sending shoes to America for database entries that America can print is really Vietnam sending tribute to the center of the empire for database entries, right? And the US government now thinks that's an unfair deal, that Vietnam is ripping off America.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
It's ridiculous, right? Now, the thing about this, I have some sympathy for it because it is true that if you have that money printing ability, then why would you ever work in a factory? I can whip out, $1 trillion printed right here. Why would I work for a living and make some screws, right? Another way of putting it is, with Wall Street, have you ever seen those deep sea vents that like belch out sulfur, like in the movies or like, right? And, there's like these kinds of bacteria, special bacteria that are evolved for the deep sea vent that's belching out sulfur, right? So that vent is like the Fed. And the sulfur is the printed money, and the bacteria are Wall Street. Okay. And Wall Street, it's not like they're like so smart about trading and so on and so forth. It's that they're near the flow of printed money. And so that entire economy is basically subsidized by the Fed, which is subsidized by the global empire, which is the money printing ability. The level to which the US economy is dependent on printed money, people they just don't really understand it. They still think it's like the economy of 1945. What I call it is a Potemkin American. Like the Potemkin village,
yeah,
right?
Very true.
Very true. And one way of putting it is, the tricky part about this is the U.S. economy used to be real. And then it was by degrees virtualized imperceptibly. It's kind of like, shrinkflation. You start with like some old school, like a box of Pringles or like a case of Pringles or something like that. And then the engineers get to work and they start popping in the bottom, so it's got like less volume, and they pop in the top, and like they shrink the interior. They basically do everything they can in terms of optics so that they're actually selling 50 ounces of chips or whatever rather than 100 ounces of chips for the same price. It's like virtualized, and by degrees it just gets worse and worse and worse. Shrinkflation, right? So shrinkflation, virtualization, Potemkinization, whatever you want to call it, until you get to this sorry point that these institutions, these companies, these legacy brand names are like cardboard and like falling over like a Potemkin village. And you think of the CDC or the FBI or General Motors or Time Magazine or Harvard or any of these things that used to be like so great, and all the energy and life has been Hollywood, it's going to zero, right? All these things are, this is also why there's so many sequels coming out of Hollywood. It's just on repeat from the 80s, right? So
yeah,
anyway,
and I think it's my general thesis on the fiat enshittification of everything, where because people can't save for the future, people's time preference rises. They start discounting the future more, and everybody needs to make a quick buck. And your business can't survive by building things that last for a long time. And it needs to always cut corners to try and keep the price down, because inflation is always eating in the margins, and people don't like it when you raise the price. So you need to compromise with the quality. And so everything gets compromised. And I mean, in the US, there's an enormous amount of products that are just trinkets. And as you say, Potemkin, like you buy the grill and it looks like a real grill on the box, but then you assemble it and it's practically disposable. One tiny little thing goes wrong and the whole thing falls apart. I think there's so much of that, and I think it's the fiat issue. I think this is why it's a fake economy, because price signals and market feedback has been replaced over the past 5-6 decades in particular, but century more generally, has been replaced with government edict. The best way to be the best shoemaking company is not to make the best shoes, is to be well connected with the financial industry, with the government, be able to secure good credit, and then you don't have to worry about the shoes. Playing the foreign exchange market is more important for many companies than being good with their production. So things all shift toward high time preference, short-term focus, and compromising quality and deterioration. And that's why you see all these brand names essentially falling apart, whether physical or reputational. The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by CoinKite. CoinKite are my favorite makers of Bitcoin hardware. They produce the legendary Open Dime, the first Bitcoin bearer asset, as well as the reliable Cold Card hardware wallet, the excellent stainless steel seed plates for storing your seed phrases, and the block clock. Now, CoinKite have produced the Sats card, a card the size of a credit card which can store Bitcoin and works great as a gift. CoinKite have just produced a limited edition gorgeous Bitcoin Standard Sats card, which carries the Bitcoin Standard logo, and you can get it from coinkite.shop/Bitcoin Standard. Use the code Bitcoin Standard to get 5% off your purchase. This podcast is also brought to you by the Bitcoin Way, your professional Bitcoin IT team offering you personalized, secure, and comprehensive solutions for every step along your Bitcoin journey. The Bitcoin Way offer live concierge service to guide you with your Bitcoin cold storage, running your node, privacy best practices, inheritance planning, corporate strategy, and multi-sig solutions. They don't touch your coins, they guide you through the process of acquiring your coins and securing them. If you'd like to make your setup safer and more reliable, book a consult with them and see what they have to suggest. If you want to give someone the gift of Bitcoin, get them this professional service that will ensure they start off knowing exactly how to manage their coins and not lose them. Go to thebitcoinway.com and start Bitcoining more confidently.
Now, I will say something, which is, this is a piece that I feel I would not say that I I don't think I have 100% confidence in what I'm about to say. Let's call it a tentative hypothesis I want to probe on, think about, and so on and so forth. Sometimes I'll float a draft kind of thing out there. So one thing some people will sometimes give me a counter argument on is say, well, look, China prints a lot of money, and they have done at times competitive devaluation seemingly with the US, and they want to devalue their currency to make their exports great. Why is it working for them when it's not working for America? And I had to think about this a little bit, and my draft answer, which I reserve the right to change, and if I get it wrong or something like that, but my draft answer is basically, if inflation is taxation without legislation, that's like Milton Friedman's line, if you've heard that one, right? And China's taxing in this way, the big difference is they're actually spending it on public works that actually do increase the productive capability of the Chinese people. So it's not just a bridge to nowhere or a fake bridge or like some weird make work NGO project or something like that. It's like the Hong Kong, Macau, like super bridge, or it's, like there's a lot of really interesting public works type things that they've done in China. Basically, they spent the printed money wisely on balance. Yeah. Like you can't walk around China and not see it looking pretty amazing.
Yeah, but I think
I'm not saying. Go ahead. Say.
If I would say, please. I would give a different answer to that one. I think it's because in the U.S. they spend a lot of infrastructure as well. Famously the fast rail between San Francisco and L.A. That was
but
a lot of expenditure. Yeah, I mean it wasn't
spending,
built.
But not
That's
results.
a small detail, but they still. Right. They still spent a lot of money. So I don't think the US is failing because they're not spending enough on infrastructure. They're clearly spending more than enough on the SF to LA fast rail train, which doesn't exist. But I think
it's not the results. They have the spending, but they don't have the results. China has results.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, the American cost, or whether you call it graft or you call it legal graft, right? Like what California did is legal graft, where it's $100 billion or whatever the number is on the train. And they made the mistake of actually posting a photo showing what had been built. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Did you see that? Do you remember that?
Yes. Yeah.
And it was like,
yeah.
It was like a half a mile or something like that. And they were so proud of it or whatever, right? And it was finally a visual thing where normally they avoid the visual. It's all words and word clouds and what have you, right? But I think that's the difference. China's actually competent.
But I think what explains that. I think what explains that is not so much the lack of spending in the U.S. I think the key difference is that the Chinese cannot export their inflation. The Americans can. Americans can get the cheap shoes from Taiwan and Vietnam and China and all over the world. They can get all of these products without having to work for them. So everybody in the U.S. essentially faces this trade-off where whether you go and get an actual real job producing things of value and get paid, or whether you find your way to the fiat money printer. And, given that real work is difficult, it's uncertain, you may get into all kinds of problems with it. It's highly risky. Whereas, getting into the fiat money printer's good graces is a lot more sustainable and a lot better business model. You don't have to work and you just find a way to get money. So I think the reason is ultimately that all the smartest people in the US are out there chasing quick Fed bucks, trying to play guessing tea leaves with Fed statements and figuring out all kinds of trivial bullshit in companies that are essentially, as you said, Potemkin economies. All these companies that produce reports and emails and credit to one another and just lending to one another. It's all excuses to run the money printer. And it's all well-connected firms, and they get access to cheap credit, and they just need to continue to make enough work essentially to justify the credit line, and then essentially they do credit arbitrage. They borrow it from the Fed at 3%, and then they lend out to other people at 6%, and they need to look busy while they do that. That's the entire business model, because ultimately there is an entire planet that's out there that's buying these dollars. So you just need to get into the good graces of somebody who has access to the money printer. You get a lower interest rate and you're set. That's what the smart people in the US are doing. You can't do that in China. not
You have to work
because
for a
of
living.
communism. You can't do that because the Chinese can't export their inflation. They can't just print money and send it abroad and buy things. They have to make things, and they've been making things for 40, 50 years, and they've been getting a lot better at it. So all the smart kids in China are out there making actual products, building actual bridges. That's how they eat. You know, it's not. It's. I don't think it's some kind of accident that over the last 100 years, China went from being dirt poor, and the U.S. was building amazing bridges 100 years ago, and today it's the opposite. I think it can't be an explanation in the people. I think it's something about the economic incentives, and I think ultimately it's inflation. And yes, I am guilty of explaining everything with inflation, but just because I do it doesn't mean it's wrong.
It's an important. I mean, it is going to be the phenomenon of our times. It's funny, like, you know, the 1930s were the Great Depression. We're in the middle of the Great Inflation. And I don't think people realize what that really means. I mean, I want to actually talk about this because I've got my mental model of the future and you have yours, and we can maybe line them up. We had a thread on this a few months ago where I think we really do have a kind of a similar model of things. I think the difference is, but let me give mine, you give me yours, okay? So there's tons of Hollywood movies on, like, you know, aliens landing, right? Or like robots, you know, killer robots, stuff like that. And most of them, by the way, presuppose that the present was okay, it was good enough, and these evil tech guys came and messed the whole thing up with their evil robots or whatever, right? But there's a flipped around version where it's actually the present that's dystopian. It's like mentally ill addicts in San Francisco, the money printing and so on, and maybe the future could be better if we do the right things, right? So, you know, Satoshi or what have you coming up and inventing something. But leaving that part aside for a second, I think it's useful to game out exactly what happens when a currency dies, right? So let's say you're like sitting in geostationary orbit and you're looking down on 8 billion people, okay? And they all have a little, you know, table over their heads, which has like their current bank balance and all the currencies or whatever that they hold, right? Because in a sense, this is all a game that humans play amongst ourselves to coordinate things. It's a coordination game, right? Like, for example, a bird or a wolf or something like that walking along doesn't have a name, doesn't have a passport, doesn't have any of the software layer on top of them that is currency, identity, all this kind of stuff. Only humans have that, right? Okay. So this you know, like this spirit that's looking down from geostationary orbit, it's looking down over all these people. And then what happens? Let's say one fine day, the dollar inflates to the point that basically anybody who's got a line item entry, which is a dollar or some other Western allied currency, it's at infinity, which means it's at zero. It's at Zimbabwe bucks. Okay. Now what happens? Well, let's say that happens overnight, just a thought experiment. Well, first, it's not like anything physical on the surface of the earth immediately changes. The factories still exist, right? The know-how in the heads of people still exists. The Chinese engineers still have their skills, right? They still have their missiles. They still have the electrical things still work, and so on and so forth. Also, Bitcoin users are unaffected because that's not melted in the same way. That's actually there as an entry, and that remains at a 21 million sum across all people, right? Maybe if the Chinese yuan is backed by gold, which they think they want to do, maybe that's also like not affected or not affected in the same way, right? So those ledger entries stay mostly intact, the ledger entries of factories and of hard currencies, because you can't hyperinflate away factories or what have you, right? But for everybody who doesn't have hard currencies or factories and their fiat currencies go away, they go to zero, what happens? Well, first of all, their stream of inbound, their job, that also basically, like their bonds to other people, like where they were getting their, you know, fiat to live, it's almost like a bunch of, you know, little ants or blobs on the surface of the earth that are very confused about what to do next, right? They go to work for useless paper, but it's useless. They try to go to the store to buy something, but that's not being accepted anymore, right? And the thing is, this has happened before in Germany. Obviously, as you know, it happened in Russia after the end of the Soviet Union. But the difference was, it was happening in like one part of the world, and the rest of the world had hard currency. So there's like healthy tissue around that bailed it out, right? But when it's going to happen to the dollar and it's going to happen to Western governments, those are used so widely that many people, like it'll be at least 10x the end of the Soviet Union in terms of global impact. Everybody who's speaking English will be affected by it to some extent. The degree to which you hold US dollars, US property, US real estate. A lot of people, by the way, I think are very wrong where they think, oh, land is safe. Land in America is not safe because real estate is guarded by the state. A state that runs out of money is not a state that's going to protect private property, as we already know. It's also a state that allows squatters in your homes. It's a state that allows homeless addicts in your doorstep. It's a state that allows your house to burn down in the Pacific Palisades. And it's a state that doesn't let you build up a house either, right? So if you zero this out and you zero out all the fiat bonds that are holding people together, my view is, Democrats and Republicans, they don't talk to each other. They're not on the same social networks. They certainly don't vote for each other. They don't even marry each other. Only 4% of Democrats are married to Republicans. Okay. The only thing they do to some extent today is trade with each other, even though they're like firebombing Elon's Tesla dealerships and stuff like that. There's still trade that's happening, right? But when that last piece of paper, the dollar, gets ripped in two, that last strand that's holding the disunited states of America together, because it's really disunited states, it's not the United States. Even the term American and America first, the problem is it's more coherent to say like Republican first, right? I mean, Democrats define democracy as ruled by Democrats, and Republicans define American as red American. And both of them are always confused when 50% is the other way. That's why Democrats lose an election because 50% are Republicans, and Republicans say American and 50% are blue Americans. So their words are wrong. They're like their map of the world is not correct. But when you start saying Republican first or Democrat first, and you start realizing those become ethnic groups essentially, like Sunni and Shiite, for example, or Protestant and Catholic. After the dollar goes and all legacy bonds between them are broken, first of all, they both blame each other. What'll happen is probably the Republicans will blame China and the Democrats will blame Bitcoin. That's like likely to be what happens. And I think Democrats are already siding with Chinese communists where, Gavin Newsom welcomed Xi to California and like Hassan, went to China and so on and so forth. And, I understand why that's happening. I think, that's likely to happen. The West Coast and so on will be able to get goods from China without tariffs. Republicans will become laser-eyed, assault rifle wielding, stake eating, crypto anarchisty, Bitcoin maximalists, because that's already happening as well, right? I think the way I put it is after MAGA maximalism, after orange man, orange coin. Haha. Okay. Kind of funny, right? And the reason is that after Trump, there's no other single figure, I think, who can. I mean, the Republican coalition has so many contradictions within it. It's going to be riven. And it's just going to be a bunch of people who the only thing they share is, okay, Bitcoin is good. Like an example, somebody like, I don't know, gosh, I don't want to name him, but there's like a podcaster who basically is like he's anti-Indian, he's all this, but he likes Bitcoin. So you know what? We got that, right? We agree on that. We agree on fiat, currency being bad and hard money being good. There might be 50 other things we disagree on, but we've got that. So the post-Republican, post-Trump coalition isn't really a coalition. It's a Bitcoin maximalist coalition, and it's no longer America first, because I think the outcome of the destruction of the dollar will be to end Democrats' faith in quote democracy and Republicans' faith in America. Democrats will side with Chinese communism, and Republicans will become Bitcoin maximalists. And Bukele is a maximalist, but Elizabeth Warren will side with Chinese communism, right? So any grouping that says American, that puts blue Americans and red Americans together, but has Bukele as an outgroup, is, I think, incorrect from where things actually are, right? If Bukele isn't part of your tribe as a Republican, you probably have the wrong definition of what your tribe is. At least I think that's where it's going to be in like 5 years or 10 years, right? Like MAGA is, in my view, sort of like wokeness in this sense, where it's like a last gasp type of thing to try to solve something ideologically, which is not being able to be solved that way, right? They're not going to be able to bring back the America of 1945 or 1985 or even 2005. And they're only just starting to dimly realize that. Which is not to say it's not that I don't have some sympathy for them. Even I have some sympathy for many of the Democrats too. It's just a very unfortunate situation for them where their pie has shrunk and the successors are China and the internet. So my view is that when fiat goes, it tears those remaining bonds. You have what I call American anarchy. The Democrats go to the communists, and the Republicans become hardcore Bitcoin maximalists, and that's where I think the future is. Let me pause there, get your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm not so sure about the theory of Democrat-Communist-China alliance. I think there's a lot of anti-China sentiment on the left in the U.S. as well. But
there was, but I'll show you some graphs. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I'm not as up to date with American politics as you are, but this strikes me as unexpected. So
well,
go ahead,
here's my argument on that. Basically, the thing is that you're absolutely right that from 2020 to 2024, Democrats actually did push pretty hard to try to fight China, right? Except they lost. And in losing, once you lose, then a faction of the party that disagrees is coming to the fore. So Gavin Newsom was not the anti-China one. He was the only Democrat who in 2023 got an in-person meeting with Xi in China. Okay. And he basically went and pivoted he said there's tons and tons of articles on this. You can look at Xinhua, China Today, CGTN. And what he said was he's willing to be China's long-term stable and strong partner. Xinhua commentary, welcome more Newsoms to come. Okay. And this was a very important thing. Democrats are more likely than Republicans to say U.S. and China can cooperate. So this is like a 20-point gap, and this was like, 2.5 years ago.
Wow.
Okay. And so, and I think that has accelerated over the last few years because, in a sense, Democrats just want to be part of the strongest state. And Republicans are more like an ethnic group or like a nation, or they want to be. At least, like Democrats are the state, Republicans are the nation, very roughly, right? And so Democrats wanted to, the fight with China was like, who has the strongest state? Now that they've lost, they're willing to just be administrators of essentially the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere 2.0. I'll give you a concrete version of that. Newsom has said that he doesn't want to enforce the China tariffs or the tariffs in California. Right. And because that's actually a great left populist line for him to take, since cheap Chinese goods in a time like that is going to be probably a constitutional crisis that we can foresee coming, where prices are going to soar. Newsom will say, we're not enforcing tariffs on Chinese products in California ports. The California public will probably be on Newsom's side, many of them, because they want cheaper goods. But many Republicans will say, oh, you traitor, you're basically like a strike breaker or something like that. You let this through. And there'll be a huge fight over this, right? But fundamentally, I think China's state capacity and now the Democrats are, the analogy to this, by the way, is like Venezuela, North Korea, right? China's very used to dealing with sort of post-apocalyptic socialist states, right? Like, post-dollar America will be a lot like Venezuela.
Yeah,
and
I don't know how much I agree with that. I have, I think we've discussed this on Twitter before. I think I have a much more rose-tinted glasses.
Go, give me your view. Give me your view
on this, which is, I think this is the dystopia. We are in the dystopia right now. This is it. The high inflation and the fact that people in the year 2025, when we have all these incredible machines and all this incredible software that gives us so much high productivity, and you have people living in what is supposedly the richest country in the world, in the US, working their asses off throughout their 20s and struggling to buy a house at all, and some of them may never own a house. I think this is the damage of inflation, and I think there will be, if we do actually witness the dollar die, it would be painful initially, but I think the aftermath, I don't see it as a Mad Max world. I see it the other way around. I see it as people just waking up and realizing, oh my God, I can't believe all of these horrible things that were happening to us because of fiat, and now they're over. I think so much conflict, drama, inflation, obviously theft and economic problems will just be resolved when you take inflation away. And again, I am a monomaniac. Inflation is my hobby horse. I see it everywhere. but that does not necessarily mean that I'm wrong. I think it's just it permeates through all aspects of life, and it makes government so incredibly powerful and so unaccountable that I don't think even people like me may not even get our get our hands around just how massive of a deal inflation is. So I think just as soon as people are able to acquire money that they can trust, I think the world is going to change in a very, very positive way.
So I agree that it is going to be actually a lot. I mean, all right, let me give an analogy. Think about the fall of the Soviet Union, right? Was the end of communism good for the world, right? Let's call it the end of Soviet communism, because Chinese communism kept the brand, changed the substance, right? Was it good for the world? Yes, right? Was it good for Eastern Europe? After an adjustment period? Yes. Broadly speaking, Estonia, Poland, these have all developed. Even with the various flaws, you can say, still, they're much, much, much better off than they were under the Soviet boot. Was it better for the Russians? Yes, but with major asterisks, because they had at least 10 years of Grand Theft Auto during the 90s, because they had a very bumpy understates it. Like, they had hyperinflation, they lost their empire, like life expectancy dropped like 5 or 10 years. They had basically quasi-civil war in lots of different places. They had the Chipotle civil war, and they had the Chechnya thing, and they had Serbia and Kosovo on their border, and they had guys shelling the White House, and they lost a lot of talent. A lot of high IQ people left, right? And they're essentially humiliated and prostrate on the world stage. And that basically lasted for a decade. That's what they call it, like the wild 90s in Russia. And then they got Putin in the late 90s, 99, 2000, and then he gradually restored order. And that's like, there's lots of things that are wrong about Putin, but unless you understand how Putin restored stability to Russia in the 90s, you don't understand why a lot of Russians support him, right? Even given, we can agree with many of the critiques, but just like to understand that at least through line, right? A lot of people outside Russia don't understand that. I think what happens with the end of American Keynesianism, I think I agree with you that it's better for much of the world. Huge parts of the world, like this giant tax on them goes away. That tax that was American Keynesianism. Now, it is also true that the retreat of the U.S. military means potentially lots of scores get settled. There's a lot of instability, lots of penny ante local conflicts erupt. And then we'll see if China decides to quell them or not, right? And I can see it going both ways. It basically depends on how much China's interests are there. China might be the total monkey's paw opposite of the neocons and the neolibs. You know how the neocons and neolibs, they invade all these countries, blow them up for democracy or whatever, right? China might be the total opposite, where they will trade with orthodox or quasi-orthodox Russia, with meritocratic Singapore, with kleptocratic Venezuela, with, basically Shiite Iran and Sunni, like Saudi Arabia.
They have a Ron Paul foreign policy. Free trade with everyone, entangling alliances with no one, basically.
Yes, except the issue is that empire is, the thing is, power abhors a vacuum, right? And so the really interesting question is, America, as you may know, there's a really good book called Tomorrow the World by Stephen Wertheim. And for many years, Americans were actually led by pretty good statesmen who said, you know what, let the British Empire be the empire. We don't want to be the empire, right? That's stupid and expensive and so on. We just want to build up our strength at home. But then in 1939, 1940, after the fall of France, they said, oh, well, the Nazis are actually going to crush the British Empire, and then they could take over Europe and they could block trade flows to us. And we don't want either the Nazis or the Soviets to become the global empire, so we're going to have to become it, right? So that was actually the moment, not 1945, but 1940, 1941, when Americans made the decision to play for global number one. And I wonder how much anarchy China will tolerate outside of China. I can really see it going both ways, and maybe it's situational. On the one hand, they've got their great firewall, they're armed to the teeth, no one's going to F with them at home. Why should they care? On the other hand, they've done Belt and Road, They're the world's largest trade partner. They, like every country trades with China, right? They've got fingers in every pie from Africa. They're building a whole railroad across like Latin America, if you saw that, right? Like South America, I saw this railroad and it's this thing that like vectors down across South America. And I remember asking, why is it dumping out into like the South Atlantic? Nobody's there. Then I realized it's not doing that. You know what it's doing? It's pointed towards China. So it's like a railroad where Brazil and all these, Argentina, everybody loads their stuff and it just goes boom, straight to Beijing like this way, right? Or straight to China, right? And so that's the counter argument is it has like enormous mineral and mining and other resources and interests abroad and wants to maintain stability. Plus, every country, as is the nature of things, is going to be looking for global leadership after the US collapses, in my view. And many of them, including the Democrats, are going to look to China. In fact, they already said that. Tim Walz, during the whole Iran thing, was a VP, Tim Walz is a VP. He said, if there's one, China can maybe intermediate here. Even during the Russia thing, Europeans have like reached out to China and so on and so forth, right? So there'll be a lot of, and then actually China set up BRICS. What's BRICS? It's basically a parallel UN. It's like, India, or rather Russia and China were members of the UN, or the Security Council members, right? And they left the US, Britain, and France there, and they went and founded their own UN and added India and also Brazil, right? And then South Africa, but let's say, India and Brazil are the real, new Security Council members. And so they've actually founded a bunch of things that are sort of like a parallel empire in waiting, right? Another example is, they've got this thing in Hong Kong where China this is a rumor. I don't know if it's true, okay? But the rumor is that right now HKD, as you may know, it's pegged 8-1 to USD, okay? And the rumor is like the yuan will be revalued to basically be like backed by gold. And then HKD will be the unlocked global version of the yuan. And the yuan will be the local locked version. So they have a few financiers in Hong Kong that can send around the world. And that's their sort of like airlocked kind of thing, but they can control it. So not all billion Chinese, are there, only like whatever million are needed for international trade, right? And the reason I say that's possible, maybe even likely as an outcome, is, up till 1991, I would argue that from 1945 to 1991, with all its faults, the US was better than the Soviets. Like West Germany was more capitalist than East Germany. South Korea was more capitalist than North Korea. They didn't have gulags in South Korea, whatever flaws they have, right? And people will say, oh my God, South Korea today has a lower fertility rate. Okay, fine. But I'm talking during that period, South Korea is better off, right? Chile was better off than Cuba. In general, with its faults, the American side was better off than the Soviet side. It was more win-win, more capitalist, more free. Fine. Then after 1991, by degrees, when the Soviet Union went away, America got drunk on its power and actually oppressed both its own people in the world and blew up all these countries and got into all this debt. It was like, absolute power corrupts absolutely, the whole, British saying. And it's not like you want the Soviet Union to be around, but in the absence of that balance, the US got completely unbalanced. And we saw that happen. I mean, when were you born? You're born in the 80s?
1980.
1980, me too. Yeah. So exactly the same age. So we had did you grow up in the US or Lebanon?
No. Well, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and then Palestine.
Okay, I couldn't tell where your accent was from. It's a international man of mystery accent.
Yes.
I knew, right? But you spent time in Colombia and so on and so forth. You were right?
Yeah, I lived in New York for 5 years.
Okay, great. Okay, so we've had roughly. I mean, obviously, you lived outside for a significant period of time, but we've had sort of the same lens on the world in some ways for 45 years. We've seen kind of where it is, right? And I think that the last 30-something years has been the U.S. like just seeing absolute power corrupt absolutely, and it just like wrecked itself. Like Democrats and Republicans had no one to fight but each other. And I think so why do I say all that? I think that once the dollar ends, like there's going to be enormous pressure on China, and China itself they'll take the lesson. It's funny, both China and the Maximalists, the Chinese communists and Bitcoin Maximalists will take the opposite lesson from the fall of the dollar, in my view. That lesson will be, for the Chinese communists will say, Western freedom and like all of this stuff just leads to total anarchy. We can't allow them to, do their crazy things anymore. They're radically destabilizing to the entire world, right? We need to restore order. And one of the things, by the way, you may be aware of this, maybe not, but many countries actually buy arms from both the US and China because they serve different purposes. The US arms are all pointed out. They're like missiles to blow up the guy next door. But all the Chinese stuff is like surveillance state stuff that's pointed inward. Right? Now, the thing about that is, this is complicated, but basically the entire Chinese policy, because it's the monkey's paw ops of neocons and neolibs, it'll sell that stuff even to like Venezuela. It'll sell stuff to like far left governments that are, it doesn't care so long as, in a sense, that's the legitimate government that's in power. But the problem is that if that surveillance equipment works on 1.4 billion high IQ, smart Chinese people, it'll definitely work. I mean, that's like the toughest group to like really lock down on the planet in some ways, right? It'll definitely work on some small 20 million person country that's 1/70th the size. So we'll never be able to get out of this digital force field, right? And they'll just sell the stuff to them. And so the Chinese will basically think potentially, okay, these Westerners just need to be in a box because they're absolute psychos. They're going to just, I'll come to that in a second. The maximalists will take the totally opposite conclusion, which is centralization is the enemy, fiat is the enemy. That's what destroyed us. And the Democrats have sided with the Chinese. And so they're going to take the totally opposite lesson from the end of the dollar. Now, you said it's not going to be Mad Max. And I do disagree with that. And I want to just show you just one image just to give you a sense of like what I'm seeing in my feed, right? So this kind of thing, okay? Do you see this? This is actually something, can you see the screen there?
Yeah.
Okay. This video is worth watching because it shows not just hundreds of people. Let's go. All right, so this is a group of hundreds and hundreds of people in San Francisco, okay, with stolen cars, lighting them on fire in front of the pier, which is like this #1 tourist attraction. Not just that, it's like literally where I used to walk, every day. It's like this is not. I can't tell you how highly trafficked this area is, how downtown it is, and so on and so forth. To have literal flaming cars being like, this is genuinely out of Mad Max. None of these people were punished. Like with J6, January 6th, every cell phone was tracked, right?
Yeah.
Okay. This is Mad Max. This is not an exaggeration of saying, oh, it's, right? This is something which happened and nothing happened to any of these people. And look how many of them there are. They're all taking videos and footage of it. They're taking selfies of it. All the evidence is there. And, this is literally like a Black Mirror episode. And I can show you so many things like
yes,
this.
but all of the things that you're going to be showing me are things that are filmed while the dollar is still alive. So that's not exactly proving your point. In fact, it is proving my point. This is the dystopia. We are in the Mad Max world. There you go. They are burning the cars in San Francisco. But you know why? Because of the fiat money printer. All of these people, they are able to afford the gasoline to burn these cars, to steal them, because of the fiat money printer. The fiat money printer is what allows all of this corruption, in my mind. It is ultimately at the root of the problem of the corruption of the police. It's the fact that government and the police become less and less accountable to their taxpayers because they have the money printer that they can fall back on. So they become more politicized, and they become all about trying to score political points rather than trying to enforce crime. Well, in a world in which the money printer dies, which you have hard money, people will pay for real security. If you would, just imagine, just as a hypothetical, think about how much the average person in Chicago pays in terms of taxation every year. And imagine if they stopped paying that, taxation and inflation. Imagine if they stopped paying that and they were given that money and told, you can hire your own private security with that money. So no more war in Iraq and Afghanistan and bringing democracy to Iran and education to wherever. No more spending on all of that stuff. Now you can get all of that money and spend it on private security in Chicago to keep you safe. If you did that, Chicago would become heaven in a few weeks, really.
Okay,
Everybody
so I
would clean things up because money would go toward actually enforcing security rather than going to taxes that go to government that tell you, no, we need to go fight wars that cost trillion thousands of miles away while your kid can't walk to the grocery store next door because they could get kidnapped in Chicago. You'd bring that efficiency of the market to the provision of security.
Okay, so here's why I agree with the first half of what you said, but not the second half. So I absolutely agree that wasting trillions on these wars was a terrible decision, and it's total waste of lives on the other side of the world, as well as within America. Terrible, terrible thing. I disagree with 2 points. First is the way that that's played out, for example, in Russia, is you didn't really have, quote, private security. You had essentially mafias that would shake people down. Because when the state failed, and basically just like one day, this totalitarian Soviet state and all its guards, they just weren't getting paychecks anymore from the central government. So that entire org chart was just dissolved with nothing really to take its place, or much of it was just kind of, they're all just thrown to the winds, right? There's like a residual kind of thing there, but much of it was basically gone. In many ways, many different things, the state just didn't exist. You show up to the office, the clerks aren't there. You call the police don't answer, right? The thing is that what sprouts up in its place is not a fully formed alternative police force in uniform with guys shaking your hand and smiling and so on and so forth. What sprouts up in its place are just numberless gangs that shoot each other for control of territory, and they're mafias, and you have to pay protection money to them. And that's the practical result of because the thing about security is, I would argue there's no such thing as private security, and let me explain why. Like, so let's start with the dumb version, the dumbest version, the blue American abolish the police. That's totally stupid and crazy. Maybe we can both agree. Okay, fine. Then you get to the red American, which is like Second Amendment. I'm going to have a gun. I'm going to defend myself. That's actually at best an absolute last resort, because pulling a gun on somebody means, it's like using a parachute on an airplane. It's like an absolute backup, because you're, something that's very, everything else is available. Then you get the guy who wants a private security force. First of all, I've actually had this. I've had this as an executive at various defense companies. It's very expensive. And what can they really do, right? You can have big guys surround you. Yeah, it might make it a little bit harder to kidnap you. That's true. But they can't go and clear a sniper's nest. They can't clear buildings in front. They can't sweep streets. And frankly, even if some mentally ill addict attacked them on the streets, they can't basically even use force against them, because they'd get Rittenhouse, or they get Daniel Penny. They get prosecuted for that, right? In a kleptocratic state like Venezuela or Argentina before Milei, the state's just, it's on the side of the criminals, right? And what state exists. And so you get to level 4, which is the only security is public security, because the fixed cost of providing security is so high that once order is restored to an area and there's only a monopoly of violence on it, then the marginal cost is very low, since the security forces don't have to fight everybody for control of that territory. So public security for me is the UAE, it's Singapore, it's places like that. So I think you'll have a massive exodus towards places like that. And that's actually going to be, I do think, you're going to have millions of Americans will go to places like El Salvador. Actually, it's not even theoretical, right? There's 500,000 Brits that have gone to Dubai, right?
Yeah.
And I think the other piece of it is, I think you correctly observed earlier that with the dollar, America's exporting inflation. America's taxing the world to keep up its. So when that drops off overnight, and all these widgets stop coming to the US, living standards will drop, I don't know how much, but in some areas 50, 90%, right? At that point, the thing is, when you jump off a cliff, it's there's 2 ways to get to the bottom of a cliff, right? You can walk down the stairs of the Grand Canyon or whatever, and then you can or you say you're on top of a building, you want to get to the bottom, you can jump off the side, or you can go down the stairs, right? And there's 2 different ways to get there, but one of them you get there in one piece. So complete quitting this whole thing cold turkey, it may be the only way it's going to happen, right? But it's going to be so unexpected and so most people aren't immersed in this stuff like you and I are, right? They're not, Bitcoin maximalists, really, it's funny, just saying fiat inflation and so on a million times. It's actually valuable because even at Chipotle, for example, right? We should make an illustration of this. People will yell at Chipotle for giving them less guac. Have you seen this? They'll videotape it. Okay. It's because you've got some normie person and they notice correctly that Chipotle is giving them less guac and guacamole. And they videotape the clerk to say, give me more guacamole. And the clerk is scared, so they give them more. But really what's happened, they think Chipotle is being a greedy corporation. What's actually happened is the Fed has stolen from both Chipotle and the customer, making both sides poor, and then making them scratch and claw amongst each other for less resources.
Yes.
Now, right? So you and I see that. We know that the Fed is this force like, why are housing prices so insane? Part of it is you can't build, but part of it is they've been printing the money and bidding against you in their own market and diluting you down, right? Why is healthcare so expensive? Well, part of it is because of the Fed is printing. Part of it is also regulation with the FDA, CDC, and so on and so forth. We can see that. Many seemingly zero-sum conflicts, cost of living conflicts, are because the Fed is impoverishing both sides. But when that totally goes away, it goes away in a very... it's like the end of the Soviet Union. It didn't, like communism didn't have like a transitional stage, something else. Deng Xiaoping managed a transition that kept the logo of communism and he gradually eased it out 1% or something a year. As you said, that's why I think they turned it around in the best way, right? Now, I actually, you know what I do have hopes for? I actually have hopes. I think there's a possibility that India is to democracy what China was to communism, where India, I'm at 10 bullish on India, and it's often overstated as you're either a 1 or a 10, but I'm like 6.5 or 7, because it's just much more functional than it was when I was a kid. It genuinely was a third world country when I was a kid, and it's really not that anymore. And I can actually do a lot there, and there's a better sense of community and spirit and so on. And they can't export inflation the same way, and so on and so forth. They have to, for example, they're like a distant number 2, but a real number 2 to China in nuclear, in steel. I don't know if I can show you those graphs if you want to see that, like real world things, right?
Yeah.
So it's possible that there's like a gradual shift, more gradual shift away from Keynesianism in India. Actually, in some ways, Trump is doing India a favor. You know why?
No.
India and Indians would never have weaned themselves off of America without this giant backhand that Trump gave, right? And I understand why he did that. Basically, it's because people are asking, where are all these Indians coming from? Like, why are Indians suddenly doing well in software and finance and so on and so forth? And the answer is, it's kind of like, why are the Chinese doing well? Well, they stopped being communists. Why are the Indians doing well? Well, India stopped being socialist. It's really basically as simple as that. It's more than that, but that's like the simple answer. So suddenly you start being capitalist, you actually have people starting to succeed again, right? Look at the Middle East, like Dubai, Riyadh, they're actually very functional places now, right? And there's very, very capable people in the Middle East that just have the right political system. But because of that backlash against India, India's actually found second suppliers for lots of things. It's been forced to become more sovereign. It's being forced to have maybe 5 years, 10 years, I don't know, where it's got minimum necessary America and has to have other trade partners. And it's almost like America pushed it out right before it went supernova. That's how I think about it. Let me pause there.
Yeah, well, I think the difference between the Russian example and the U.S. example is that when the currency collapsed and the state collapsed in the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, there was no alternative. People couldn't just use the dollar. There was no banking system that could allow you to have a modern 1990s economy using the U.S. dollar or the euro or some other kind of currency. People just, they lost the monetary system. And if you lose the monetary system, the entire structure of production in a society crumbles because everything falls apart. All the balance sheets melt, essentially. So there was no alternative. I think the situation is different now because we have Bitcoin. And that's not just because I'm a Bitcoiner. Well, maybe it is. But I think it's just fundamentally different because now if the same thing that happened in the Soviet Union in 1990 happens in the US this year, Americans have the ability to access Bitcoin. And I think also, yes, you're right on, it's not going to be a walk in the park. It's not going to be a picnic. But realistically, very few people have significant wealth stored in physical dollars or in checking accounts or savings accounts. It's not that much money. Most people are either in debt or they hold hard assets. So if you have stocks, if you have equity, you know, as you said, the machines are going to still be there, and they're just going to start operating on a new currency. And you may have a couple of bad months. You may have to close down for a while. You may have to restructure, or so on. But if you have a business that's profitable on dollars, there's a good chance that it will also continue to be profitable on Bitcoin. So I think if you have that, then I think the closer example would be the German recovery after World War II. So this is, free market folklore. Free market people keep liking to bring this example up. Ludwig Erhard was the Minister of Economics in Germany. I think he later became the Chancellor as well. And at some point after the World War ended, he was working under the Americans, and he just one day decided we're ending all price controls. And it was something that was completely out of the blue. The American administrators.
But the German economic miracle, basically.
Yeah, and it basically unleashed the German economic miracle. So, yeah, it was devastating at that time because what was devastating was the fact that they'd just gone through a world war, and you had all of the wreckage of the world war to contend with. But the best way to do that was to have a functioning monetary system and no price controls. And when you had that, you witnessed the German economic miracle. And by the 1960s, Germany was making some of the best industries in the world, and it had practically recovered. So I think in the analogy of dropping off the side of the building versus stumbling down the ladder or the stairs, I think
Sure.
The last 50 years have been stumbling. We're now at a point where a lot of people don't hold value in the dollar. The people who hold value in the dollar mostly are outside the U.S., and they've been through a lot of inflation as well. So it's not going to be that devastating. I know it's going to be devastating for a lot of people, but it's not that much wealth, and it's not that different, because for most of those people, sadly, it's a small amount of wealth for them that's not very life-changing. It's a couple of months' income that they have stored up in cash. It's nasty to lose that, but having a couple of months' income savings versus 0 months' income savings is not that big of a difference in most people's lives. So there's just not that much savings in dollars for this to be that catastrophic, is what I'm saying.
Okay, so I understand your point. I'd counter-argue that U.S. Treasuries, the 10-year in particular, is a reserve asset of still much of the world. Even with gold rising quickly, that's trillions of dollars there. So you're right about individual household balances, but I'd say many countries, many companies, many financial institutions, and so on are dependent on the solvency of the U.S. currency. And it's also not just their individual stockpiles, it's the edges between the nodes. It's like, the contracts that are denominated in dollars. It is more generally, using this U.S. bank to accept wires. All of that just becomes total wreckage. And it's not like it easily just then gets reused after the quote currency collapse, because you never, after a currency collapse, ACH, SWIFT, those are actually old technologies relative to obviously China's, WeChat and Alipay or cryptocurrency, but also UPI in India or PagSeguro in Brazil. America actually is an antiquated financial system because others have leapfrogged it with internet-first systems. My view is, so in the examples you gave with Germany and Russia after World War II and the Cold War, I think it is true that in both cases, America did rebuild them, because America had a functional system, and it had healthy tissue, and had a structure, and it had leadership, and it had currency markets, and so on and so forth. And so some of the order of America could be used to certainly help West Germany get back on its feet. And then also, even though they wanted Russia more prostrate than Eastern Europe, they didn't bomb Russia, not that much. They bombed Serbia or what have you. I think that the two functional systems after the collapse of America are going to be China and the internet. That's, say, Ray Dalio's Principles of the Changing World Order and the Sovereign Individual. Ray Dalio says the Western system's going down, China's coming up. Sovereign Individual says Western system's going down, the internet is booting up. If you superimpose them sort of algebraically, it's an oversimplification, but the Russian system is going down, and it's China and the internet that are booting up. And the Chinese system, like after Russia fell, there were actually, you could say the obvious alternative was America in all caps, and the very non-obvious alternative in very small characters was China. And then the Chinese thing became much bigger over time. And I think the successor to American empire is actually the internet. And the big difference, the reason everybody disagrees with me on this, is China's in all caps right now, like America was at the end of the Cold War, and the internet is in lowercase relative, like China was. You know, it's important, but you know, the fundamental thing everybody will always say is, "Oh, Balaji, the internet isn't a place. You're like a weird VR guy, you know, and so on and so forth." And I'd say that's true, but Christianity isn't a place, and yet there are Christian places. Islam isn't a place, there's Islamic places. So you can, you know, for example, you have, with Christianity, you have churches, you have cathedrals, you have entire countries with the cross on the flag, so that ideology can take territory, right? So in my view, Bitcoin and what it represents is part of it. It's a digital part. Then we have to print it out into the physical world. Print out the internet, just like you print out a Google Doc, or you have an Amazon shopping cart, you print it out into a delivery to your door, or you have an Uber, and you print it out in terms of a car coming up to the curb. We take our Bitcoin, we take all the stuff we've got on the internet, we print it out into physical communities, and that's a connection between the Bitcoin standard and the network state.
Yeah, you know, I think there's an even stronger connection between the network state and my latest book, which was just published 2 weeks ago. It's called The Gold Standard. And it's essentially a thought experiment of what happens if we had something like Bitcoin in 1915. And it's essentially similar to what you're describing as what happens after the dollar collapses. But there it happens in 1915. And the reason it happens is I invented a Bitcoin equivalent in 1910 in that story. It's an alternative history. And essentially, a bunch of aviation entrepreneurs build a gold clearance service because they realize this is the only way to scale aviation. The only way that we could grow aviation is to find a commercial application for it. And it was too expensive to move people around at that time because people are heavy. And so you wanted to move around something that was extremely valuable per unit of weight. So they decided to set up a gold clearance business in order to finance their aviation entrepreneurship. And then that thing takes off, if you excuse the pun. And when World War I comes along, that allows people to take their gold out of their banks and out of their central banks and not turn in their gold to their bank and central bank, because they could just hold their own gold and then rely on these international planes flying all over the world. And they were unstoppable because they were flying out from random fields, and there were no advanced radar detection for airplanes at that time. So it was a kind of permissionless, decentralized system for moving gold around. And effectively, it rugs the central banks of the warring parties in World War I. So the war ends because all the parties go bankrupt at the same time. All their currencies collapse. And then they can't pay their soldiers. The soldiers go home. And then the question is, all right, so what happens to the world order? And you know, I'm not going to spoil the story, but there's an international conference. The neutral countries become the essential superpowers because all the gold left. The warring countries went to the neutral countries.
Switzerland.
Yeah, Switzerland, Holland, the US, they're the ones who basically draw the format of the new world order. And without a money printer, without the ability to milk people through inflation, and without the ability to control people through the benefits of inflation that you steal from them, all of this entire idea of governments just wanting to expand territory dies, and instead they become a lot more like businesses and service providers, and it becomes a matter of competition through providing better services. And so the entirety of government is reimagined in a way that is a lot more similar to the sovereign individual on the one hand, and on the other hand, the work of Prince Hans Adam of Liechtenstein, who talks about the state in the third millennium. I think you're familiar with his work, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think it's I bring it back a century earlier, where that book was published a century earlier, and then we let it play out. But obviously, the point is it's a thought experiment of how the world would look on a Bitcoin standard. If
Well,
we had that.
I am excited to see it. I have one other thing for you, and then maybe we can wrap. So I have a video that maybe you guys can play over here. I pasted it into the chat. This is just what I'm doing over in Singapore. And basically, I've got, I'm building the San Francisco, essentially, it was easier to start Bitcoin than to end the Fed, or rather to reform the Fed. And it's easier to start a new city than reform San Francisco. And so I have a startup city on the other side of the world that I've been moving people into. And we have folks from the Middle East, and we have folks from India, we have folks from America, we have, the Chinese Capitalist Party, in a sense, haha, right? Like, and we have all kinds we have people from more than 100 countries, right? So let's see if we can play.
I am. He found a massive empty city on a ghost island and rented thousands of rooms, and then invited tech people from around the world to come and build their startup here.
My name is Balaji, and this is the Network School.
Here at a green island in Malaysia, right next to Singapore.
Singapore is only like 40 minutes away, right there.
Balaji and his team created a startup city for tech people.
They stay together.
Each founder gets their own room with a very spacious bathroom.
So you don't have to think about anything except working in your startup and working out.
They work out together. Founders push each other to burn calories and build muscle together.
So how many people work out in a day? About 110 to 120.
That's like 60% of people working out.
They work together. Every entrepreneur works on their own crazy idea.
I'm building a creative AI lab.
We build a consulting company that helps nature.
I'm building Siri, but better.
The whole idea is to build a San Francisco that doesn't suck. San Francisco is violent, criminal. We can do better. We must do better.
Cheers! They eat together. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, all healthy, all included.
You have alcohol?
No.
You have energy drinks?
No.
Coffee, water, everything is healthy. That's it.
Pretty much.
That's cool.
They chill together. Imagine living here in a resort by the beach, 50 minutes from Singapore, chilling with your best friends, building your dream business.
It's easier to start a new city than to fix San Francisco. All the people in San Francisco have come from all around the world. We just need to bring them somewhere else, and that's what we're doing.
You are the average of the 5 people around you. So if people live this life with these people on this island,
You can build something great together. Thank you, man.
Glad you liked it. Come to Network School.
This is awesome.
So I think that's pretty cool. I think it's well, actually, I'd love to get your reactions on it. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah, no, that is fascinating. So I'm not quite sure how this leads to the network state thing, because this seems to be a little bit different, perhaps.
Well, so the way I think about it is as follows. Facebook started as just a Harvard social network. Then it became a college social network. Then it was also high school. Then it was like basically all Americans. Then it was the world, and so on and so forth. It's like in stages, right? And so what we're proving here is that we can basically populate the land from the cloud. And, that video basically was more startup focused and founder focused, but really a much more citizen focused, right? Not everybody has to be a founder. In fact, I've got this post coming out, which is like titled Fundamentals Over Founderitis. I think being a citizen, being like having good relations with your fellow man, having a good job, having a wife or a husband, having kids, having a family, having all of these kinds of things in life is more achievable than, the 0.0 whatever percent of people who can be a tech founder. Nothing wrong with the latter, but I think we've got an over focus on that. So it's more focused on fundamentals really, though it'll start with tech adjacent people simply because they're early adopters of things. And what I want to prove out is that we can get, actually, we've already passed this number by a lot. First get 1,000 and then 10,000 people. And then eventually, if you can get to there, we can get to 100,000 people from around the world that have come to a new location. This is what I call the fractal frontier. All these pockets of the world, these empty islands, or for example, in America, they've got college campuses for sale because they're bankrupt. Or in Japan, they've got IKEA, which are abandoned villages because their population has declined and so on. If we can populate the land from the cloud, then we can do what I talked about earlier, which is we take the social network and using Bitcoin, we print it out into the physical world, and we use the Bitcoin to acquire or to lease land, right? We move people in there and we print out that social network. And if we can prove that here, then we can prove that in all the nodes around the world. And that brings the network state that I talked about earlier. Now, with one caveat, which is I don't plan to declare independence or anything like that, and blah, blah, blah. I think about how Bitcoin had a long path before it finally got recognized by El Salvador as being a national currency. That was not predictable at the beginning. The ricochet of all these things that would lead to that. That was like 12 years after the founding of Bitcoin. So I'm patient, we'll play the long game, and eventually somewhere in the world, some country, some jurisdiction can offer us a measure of diplomatic recognition. For example, the UN actually has thousands of NGOs that it recognizes in some form as like being observers, right? There's dozens of small countries that $1 billion actually goes a long way there. And if you could bring global tech people there and global capital there and make all the locals richer, and they might give you some peninsula or some island they're not using and you can build there, for example, right? All these kinds of things I think will be possible as the map opens up. But for the time being, it's just building the community and then building a formula that we can use to print out the cloud around the world. Yeah, hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, I think there's a. I've been leaning toward the idea that maybe this is something that's going to, a lot of these technologies, we think that they're going to move us towards new things, but all they end up doing is taking us back to older things. People go back to primitive ways because there's a reason these stuck around for a long time. So I'm curious.
There's a lot of value in tradition. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious what you think of the idea, and this is sort of my my weird quirk in the Bitcoin. Well, I have many weird quirks, but one of the weird ideas that I have that people are most shocked to hear me espouse is monarchism. And I generally, I'm a fan of monarchies. I live in a monarchy and I'm very happy to be in a monarchy. I like having kings. I very much prefer them to parliaments. And I think ultimately the reason for that is that I think kings run countries like a family business. So that gives them a long-term perspective. They expect to be in power for decades. They expect their children and grandchildren and their grandchildren to be in power for many centuries to come. And so there's an incentive alignment there. You want your grandchildren to be happy and safe and prosperous, and the king wants your grandchildren to be happy and safe and prosperous so that his grandchildren can tax yours efficiently. And it seems to me like this is, this is an institution that has been around forever. It's as far back as humans have written history. They've had kings, and it's one of those things that we've had forever that in the 20th century we very confidently and arrogantly dismissed because now we have better things. And we thought we could just replace it. And then most places that ended up getting rid of their kings ended up suffering all kinds of horrific outcomes for it. So I wonder if my hypothesis, well, it's not my hypothesis. I mean, Hans Hermann Hoppe and many others have spoken about the difference in terms of time preference when it comes to monarchies versus democracies. But if that hypothesis holds up, then play it out over the next 10, 20 years, you'd expect that monarchies, being long-term focused, would accumulate a lot more Bitcoin, and then they would benefit from the accumulation of Bitcoin. Whereas democracies and republics, short-term focus, every president comes in for a few years and he's eager to steal as much as he can and settle as much scores with his enemies as he can. And so it's a war of all against all, and there's very little stacking sats taking place. There's a lot more conflict, a lot less long-term vision, and a lot less sat stacking. Now, extrapolate that for another couple of decades, and add the debt crisis that you mentioned, I think we may end up in a world in which kings will reign again. Places that don't have kings are going to likely want to join kingdoms. So I think we'll see a world that is maybe more politically flexible, as I think, people will want to join their neighboring country. They've had enough of these 20th century abstractions. We have this country and it has this flag, but things are always terrible and they continue to suck and our government is in debt. Well, you know what? I'm happy to take my neighbor's flag if it means that I'll finally not have inflation. So I think maybe what it'll end up happening is, I think ultimately you and I agree on the same pivotal point, which is exit over voice. Or as I like to put it, there's a chapter in my book, choice, not voice. Right. People get the choice to exit their political arrangements, to vote to join any other political arrangement, and that I think is a much more effective way of organizing anything. The reason your iPhone works is not because you are voting in Apple elections. It's not because you're out there giving your opinion on design, on hiring, on marketing, or any of that stuff. You get to do one thing only. Choice. You get to decide if you're going to buy it or not, and then they sort out all the details. So I think this is a much healthier way of providing incentives, and I think maybe as we head towards this freer world, we head to this world of less government predation through inflation, that's just going to move people back to the old institution of monarchy. What are your thoughts on that?
So there's a lot I can say on this, and I have a talk on it and so on and so forth that maybe you can link in the show notes. It's called Technodemocracy. Mm-hmm. But while I agree with many individual points you're making, I want to offer a few complementary points in a partial reframe. Okay, so first, let me start with all the parts we agree on. Essentially, Democrats, in the name of democracy, have plundered many American states and also much of Western Europe, with fiat currency in particular. It's just giant highway robbery. But I think that it's interesting because I would argue that at a deep level, democracy and capitalism are both about choice. Whereas capitalism is a choice of what you do with your dollar, and democracy is a choice of who governs you. Like the consent of the governed is, if you were to make a radical in the sense of root argument, take away all the superstructure, have you consented to this government or not? The reason that you like the country you're in is you may think that leader, and you may correctly think that leader does a good job, but you consented to it. You're not forced in there, right, and so on and so forth. I would argue that is voting with your feet, and that is a form of democracy, and that I would argue that interpretation of democracy between states rather than within them is going to become dominant for a very important reason, and I'll show you a visual that'll explain why. Basically, this is a funny graphic and kind of a joke, but it's also true. Can you see this?
Okay, yes, now I can.
Okay, so this is a joke, but it's also true. Democrats and communists have both built one-party states. Ha ha ha. Okay, I think it's funny, but it's also true. This is the Communist Party of China, 100, 200, communists. This is the Communist Party of California, where it's all Democrats. And it's been all Democrats for the past 15 years, which means Democrats destroyed democracy. Elections are held, but the party always wins. And in fact, the dysfunctionality of California with $100 billion trains to nowhere really got going, and you can look at it right as they essentially destroyed democracy in California in the sense of having a competitive party with some check and some balance on what they could do. Now, in response, Republicans have now started to gerrymander Republican states. And so we're getting a world where you have one party Democrat blue states, one party Republican red states, and one party Chinese communist states. Which means that your actual democracy is between states rather than within them. So your actual substantive choice is actually between. And I think we can make that very concrete in the sense of, Rousseau has this concept, and I know he's a leftist, but hear me out, okay?
Sorry,
Rousseau
who was it?
Rousseau.
Oh, yeah.
Jean-Jacques Rousseau, right? Like the old philosopher. So he has a concept of the social contract, and many libertarians argue with it, where they say, I didn't sign any social contract. But sometimes you can take thesis, antithesis, and come up with a synthesis. So you may have been at like various tech offices, and they've got an iPad, and you have to have a click through to sign, like a non-disclosure agreement, right? Imagine something like that, but for your city, and you actually have to sign it on chain. And it's a genuine contract. It's like a real contract, like a binding contract. And what it does, for example, there's different ways of doing this, but you could pledge a portion of your Bitcoin wallet at, you pledge $1,000, for example, as essentially an entrance fee for the city. And it has a bunch of terms, which are called the social smart contract, and you sign it, and you get back a little token in your wallet that says, okay, you can now enter the city because you signed the social smart contract. This is not theoretical, by the way. We're implementing this now. This talk I've got here called Technodemocracy talks about it. What that means in practice is everybody who comes to your jurisdiction, whether digital or physical, has to sign a social smart contract where they get an NFT or a token or some digital asset of some kind that is also the key to their door, and that also has an I voted sticker on it, which says they voted for that government. So in a sense, for example, let's say the monarchy that you're entering, you could think of that person, and that person could actually be a president who is accumulating votes from every person who's chosen to be there. In a sense, that just formalizes what you've already done. But it shows, in particular, when they're voting against California and they're voting for the UAE, that is actually democratic choice, right? We just define it in a different way as the choice of government includes a physical component of moving versus just completely sessile, right? And this is a concept: vote with your feet, vote with your wallet, just like you vote with your ballot, right? And what I argue for, kind of like if you think about Bitcoin itself, it took three things that had been disparate, which were Visa style, transaction approvals, seigniorage, which was previously a province of the central bank, and then also like the fintech APIs, and it kind of bundled that all together into Bitcoin. It kind of took pieces of the existing financial system and rebundled them, It also put bank accounts there with Bitcoin addresses and so on and so forth. It's very clever in many ways. We take pieces of the existing system and we rebundle them because I think the fundamental thing that people can lose sight of that is still valuable is you do want a choice of who your government is, but you're okay if that is a president or a CEO. But you still want a choice. And that's why I think the future is China versus internet, in the sense of a 1 billion person Chinese superstate and 1,000 million person network states. But those network states are run by presidents who have cryptographically provable democratic legitimacy, because every single person who's in their society has an on-chain thing that shows that they voted for that social smart contract. And every vote counts because you can count all the votes. You can prove every single person in that society signed that social smart contract before entering. This also, in a very important way, binds both the voter and the leader. Because today, for example, we take for granted in democracies that, someone can run for office and say whatever they want and then do whatever they want. And conversely, the person who's voting takes no responsibility for the crazy things that have happened in their society. Like some, leftists will vote for abolish the police and then be surprised that there's crime, or a rightist will vote for some crazy war and be surprised that they're drafted or something like that, or that they're suddenly, they're much poorer. And instead here, everybody gets exactly what they voted for. And if they don't like it, they can leave and vote for another one. So we just make the voting, it may seem like a simple procedural thing, but it's not, because from a libertarian standpoint, you can understand a contract is actually, the signature is actually pretty important. It's not just vibes, right? So by actually making it so that when you step across a jurisdiction, you've actually filed a vote that anybody else can see, it's almost like a marriage contract, but it's like a binding vote on both sides, because the social smart contract says what that government can and can't do. And they kind of pre-agree. Like, for example, a small example of this, when you land in Singapore, there's a little card in the airplane pouch and says death penalty for drug smugglers. That's like the social smart contract, but you can imagine a whole long thing like this that you have to read and really think through before you sign on to go into that new state. It seems like just a formalism, but I think it's much more than that. So I think that gets basically both sides what they want. I think the right focuses on efficiency and the left focuses on legitimacy. And the left wants people who are legitimate, even if they're completely incompetent and evil and crazy, and the legitimacy was through some, messed up process, but they at least want some formal legal process of some kind, even if abused. The right just cares about the vibes, but they don't think about how, yet at the same time, they're still like electing Trump, they're still running in elections and so on. Even as, quote, anti-democracy as often they are, they still are sort of working through the system because they underrate the importance of having a system. And in my view, this synthesizes the two, where you have the leadership efficiency of the right, but you have the provable, legal, formal system of the left, which actually does scale and has its own value to it. So that is how I think about getting you something very similar in some ways to what you want, but that has that crucial aspect of democratic legitimacy, consent, a social smart contract, votes, and so on and so forth, especially given, and this is crucial, that Democrats have destroyed democracy. We should not let them claim the term democracy. They mean democracy like the North Koreans mean the Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, right?
Yeah.
There is no substantive democracy in the DPRK. There's no substantive democracy in California because there's no substantive elections, no substantive choice. The democracy in California is the exit. So we should call that what the true democracy is. That's the only way you have a choice between parties is between states, not within them. Let me pause there.
Yeah. I'm gonna give you a little bit of a metaphor here.
Go ahead.
There's probably there are probably two approaches to health. There are the people who just keep thinking about all of these new modern ways that you can add all these new pills.
The Brian Johnson style.
Yeah, Brian Johnson's and all the procedures and all the latest research and all the press release from Harvard Medical School that says, we're going to have that magic pill that's going to do all these magic things you've always wanted. So there's that approach, and then there's the other approach, which I'm a big fan of, where the only thing I do is I just quit all garbage food and all garbage science and make sure that I don't consume bad food, don't consume bad science, and I just eat meat and I drink water. That's the only food and the only supplement that I take, and I've been doing it for more than 10 years, and it works great for me. And I mean, I don't want to impose it on anybody, but I also don't want anybody to impose it on me, to impose their thing on me. So I'm not out there trying to force people to eat this way, except for my kids. But I don't mind people trying out all kinds of crazy pharmaceutical things, as long as they try them themselves. Now,
Totally.
Yeah, but the problem is there's this kind of this fascination with modernism, which thinks of new good things have to be so good. They must be so good that clearly we have to force people to use them, because if we don't force them, they don't know what's good for them. Going back to the Rousseau idea, people need to be forced to be free. People need to be forced to be healthy. They need to be forced to take the magic Pfizer juice because they don't understand epidemiology. They don't understand modern science. And so, what you think you know about health doesn't matter. You have to take the magic juice. And if you don't, then you will face consequences. So what I'm trying to get at is that these two distinct approaches, I mean, obviously in some things you want technology, I'm not a Luddite, right. I'm not arguing against technology, but in many ways, in many things, what technology facilitates is really getting rid of the previous crappy technology that has hobbled us for a while. And now we can go back to not being hobbled by it. So for me, the point of Bitcoin is to get rid of all the trash that fiat has caused. And rather than build this new, highly sophisticated modern world, I think Bitcoin might make the world a lot more primitive, in particular in the example of finance. I think finance on a Bitcoin world is going to be a lot simpler than finance on a fiat world, and I describe in detail why in the fiat standard. But I wonder if this might be the case when it comes to governments, and that when we get rid of all of the barnacles of fiat that have attached to the otherwise really aerodynamic or fluid dynamic boat that we have, then I think we may find ourselves going back to something a lot more traditional, and that will essentially scratch the itch of what people actually want. And that will actually satisfy what people want. Because I mean, maybe all of these modernist abstractions about how the world should look, maybe we don't really need all of that stuff. And I think maybe we don't need all of these smart contracts. I'm obviously very skeptical of any of this stuff actually working in the real world. Because, for instance, for me, the key issue is, for instance, it's a smart contract or it's a kind of blockchain record that maintains the ownership of your house. Okay, well, what happens if I hack your private key? Obviously, that doesn't mean I can walk into your house and now it's your house. Or if I hack your stock portfolio, if I hack Zuckerberg's private keys, I can't just waltz into Facebook's offices and tell them, nope, I have the blockchain record of ownership. I have the private key. Facebook is mine. Get this bum Zuckerberg out of here, and I'm going to start running the place. That's not how property works, So I don't think these kind of novelty applications of blockchains might really make the big difference. I think the real difference here is getting rid of fiat. I think that's where we're going to be producing the changes more than any kind of technical improvement or any kind of innovation in governance. It might just be the case that just like with diet and nutrition, once we are able to really understand what's going on, we just go back to meat and water. Maybe we just go back to kings, and then you get to choose which king you want to be with. We go back from a world in which the kings were essentially monopolists, and then we thought that the way out of that was to have more control over the decisions that the kings makes, and then we give the parliaments more power, and then we replace the kings with presidents. Well, maybe no, we shouldn't get into the management. We should just stick to the choice. And when we get to the choice, then kings will start competing for customers, essentially, through providing services. And maybe that's really the real change that Bitcoin will make.
So let me give a few quick responses on that. Very good points. I want to say first, I'm actually very sympathetic to in a sense, I think of it as the past and the future versus the present, right? So I think if to very oversimplify, what you would represent or what you're advocating for is the proven past. And what I care about is the far future. But both of us would agree that the fiat Keynesian, Kamala Harris, pantsuit, whatever stupid world is a disaster, right? That's a disaster. But we'd agree for somewhat overlapping, but also distinct reasons. Roughly, it's like the Elon technologist side of things is kind of where I land up, but I'm sympathetic in many ways to the maximalist, muscular, assault rifle, stake, and so on kind of argument. And I'd say that many times, I don't know what fraction of times, 7 times, 8 times, 9 times out of 10, the traditional answer is the correct answer, right? Because it's been proven over thousands of years. But one time out of those times, for thousands of years, man couldn't fly, and then he could, right? And so the traditional answer was correct until it wasn't correct. And in fact, the traditional answer said, don't be so arrogant. Don't be Icarus. Icarus flew too close to the sun. His wings melted and he crashed and so on. But now we just have commercial aviation. And so I am, the thing is it's almost like yin and yang, right? I think there's a productive tension between those things where if you can remain grounded and if you can articulate why a conservative or a, someone from when I say from the past, that's not exactly the right term. I think conservative is a good way of putting it. It's roughly conservative, leftist, libertarian are roughly, past, present, future, roughly, right? Or conservative, progressive, libertarian, right? And so there's lots of things I'm sympathetic to conservatives on. I agree that almost every change that leftists make tends to be bad and so on and so forth. But I do think it's worth having some degree of technological change because some of them turn out to be good, number one. Number two is on the locks thing and so on and so forth. That leads us down to other kinds of chains, but I'll just say a few things, which are, A, you can have smart locks now, and there are smart locks that are controlled by smart contracts. You can use them for managing entire properties like Airbnb style. B, I think that as we get more drones and we get more robots, you will be able to have and will eventually have fully electronic enforcement of things, which is a whole new kind of scenario and can of worms. But like if we look at what the Russia-Ukraine war is, just like the cavalry was obsolete in World War I and they were cut to ribbons by machine guns, the human soldier is becoming obsolete after the Russia-Ukraine war. It's not all the way there, but it's getting there. And it's all drones, it's all robots. And that is the kind of thing that could be, moved, like they could hover there and they could be, driven by the internet and they could enforce laws potentially, depending on how you think about how autonomous they get. And then the third point is there are on-chain entities that control large amounts of resources. And while you're right that that Facebook has a significant offline component, there are smart contracts where if you got the key to Uniswap or something like that, you basically could. They set up SushiSwap and they actually got a bunch of the funds and traded on it. Fine, you don't have to worry about all that stuff. I agree that you can just not think about that whole set of things. Let's just speak maximalist for a second. I actually do agree with you, by the way, that the upcoming conflict, let's call it yin and yang. Hopefully it'll be a conflict in some ways. It'll hopefully be a productive tension in other ways, or even a synthesis, is between what you might call primitivism and futurism, or others would call it like humanism and transhumanism, or others would call it the past and the future. And the thing about it really boils down to, what are we put on this earth to do? And a lot of people will have the intuitive argument that you're put on this earth to, basically marry and have kids and, just reproduce your ancient culture and language and your territory. And that was good enough for my ancestors. Why isn't it good enough for me? Fine. That's a conservative argument. I understand that, sympathetic. It's the right answer for many people. On the other hand, what makes humans human, if you look at the history of encephalization, like, the ancestors of humans, like the early hominids and so on, it's a graph that goes woof like this in terms of the size of brains, right? And in fact, if you look at human evolution, humans, or the ancestors of humans, they used to have fur. They don't have fur, instead they have clothes. They used to have actually more digestive enzymes. They outsourced that to fire. They used to have fangs and claws. They instead have spears. And so for millennia, we've actually had technological advancement as the core of being human, where you're pushing it all into software in your head, this big brain. And so you don't have to have fangs because you put the targeting into software and you throw a spear. You don't have to have fur because you're smart enough to get clothes. You don't have to have digestive enzymes and hardware because you do it with fire. And then eventually you build civilizations and so on and so forth. And so in a sense, technology is the history of humanity. Like that's what distinguishes us from apes, is constant progress like this, right? And so I think that those are just like yin and yang, male and female, right? Past and future, I can make an argument for the past. And I would say that, I don't know what fraction, 9 times out of 10, it's correct. So most people should just go with that. And it'll produce a pretty good life. And you can do proven things and so on and so forth. But all progress also depends on the unreasonable man. You've probably heard that one, right? Mm-hmm. And in a sense, by the way, you and I are both unreasonable men versus Keynesianism in its own way. But I think we're reasonable with each other, and I think we're reasonable people. So I don't know. That's my view on things. I don't want to be, and one last thing I'll say is, you may disagree with a lot of stuff Brian Johnson does, but I think you would agree that at least he's an improvement over McDonald's slop. Right? He's like fit. He's taking care of his body. You might do a simpler version of that, but at least he's like an improvement over somebody who's just like 50 pounds overweight and they're shuffling McDonald's slop, right?
Yeah, I mean, an improvement over the standard American diet, for sure. Or an improvement over the fiat version. I think that's the key thing.
Yes.
But the interest, and of course, there's no fixed answer. In some cases, the Brian Johnsons will come up with incredible new technologies that will be important, like Bitcoin. And in other cases, we're going to realize that all of this tinkering is pointless, and you should just
most cases perhaps.
Yeah, for most cases, you should just eat the steak, figuratively.
Yes. Hey,
and on that,
this was great.
Yeah, I know we've gone over time, but I really want to thank you for your time. This has been really fascinating and thought-provoking. Really appreciate it. Any final words?
Well, I'll tell my followers to buy the Bitcoin Standard. You should tell them to get the network state. It's free online.
Yes, get the network state free online.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Great.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Saifedean.
Take care.
Okay,
Bye-bye.